we gather today to remember and invite the spirits of all of the beings who have striven to awaken our people to remember the nature of origin, intelligence, insight, wisdom. And we particularly honor those who strove for a beautiful world for our ancestors and for us and for our children, and for all of the living beings of Earth, all of those beings who strive for, and dream and work and struggle and have suffered to give us new ways of knowing and seeing and being together that are as profound as they are liberating, virtuous, and beautiful. We honor those beings who have come before us and those who are here now and those who will come after us, and invite them to participate in our explorations today. So you were talking about something related to the features of language and its sonic character. Perhaps you could say more about that, or tell me what you were thinking about.
Yeah, I was reconsidering the nature of representational cognition and its relation to language. So I became aware that representational cognition, or symbolic cognition, probably results from the equilibrium state of the human body, which is a necessary evolutionary stage. But in our current state of cognition, we tend to treat time as if it were some kind of linear unfolding, which makes death appear to be this boundary encompassing our phenomenal experience. So death is the point at which we cease to exist in time. But if time isn't a container, then death isn't a boundary in the ordinary sense. And this relates to what I was discussing with you a few weeks ago about the connection between language and death, or cognition and death. Because I think in a certain sense, language already anticipates death. So death is simply the revelation of what language already foreshadows in a certain respect. So I was just reconsidering the acoustic nature of language in terms of these forms of resonance in the human body and in other kingdoms of nature. So death isn't really an event in time, it's an alteration in how time is engaged. So when we speak or when we think, we're preparing for a new mode of navigating temporality, I think, at some level. So I think what takes place in language and in thought is this kind of foreshadowing of the possibility of navigating time in a more tactile way, as opposed to existing in time and regarding time as this more optical or vision-based phenomenon. Because in our sort of representational cognitive state, we tend to encompass phenomena with our thinking, which is a visual operation. So we're sort of encircling or encompassing phenomena when we talk about phenomena, as in science. But there's a higher form of cognition that I'm trying to get at, which is more tactile. And I think that's what death fundamentally is. So when we learn how to think properly, we're learning how to navigate the post-mortem realm. I think that's sort of what's going on.
Oh, wow, that is so rich and fraught with possibility. So, one of the things that's obvious to me is that the ways that we're trained to think about fundamental features of existence that we have given names to, right? Time, light, matter, anatomy, bodies, biology, and so forth. The features of our embodied experience can be understood as unique features of temporalization, expressions of time, or even in different layers of what's going on. How to put this? So there's a layer above linear time. There's a layer above biology, or within it, or both. And our speaking can be understood as a form of structuring temporality, but it can also be understood, our bodies as well, as forms of time making. Does this make any sense?
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, without biologies, there are all these aspects of time that don't exist. Biologies are a way of temporalizing, making forms of time in the layer of material existence, which, of course, we tend to presume is primary or the only one, right? Because we don't have the same kind of experience of other features, other layers. Give me a sec here. Is that yours, son?
Huh?
Is that yours?
No. This is, I'm guessing, the piano.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay.
It's like we shipped through a war zone.
Yeah. So what you're saying is very profound. I'm going to try to say it back to you in a much simpler way. Speech is an act that doesn't merely anticipate death, it participates in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is a wildly uncommon perspective.
Yeah.
It's almost like importing death into the moment in a way where we are unconscious of our speech having anything to do with that. And this resembles what I was talking about and thinking about over the past couple of months, where I suspect that features of our affinities and disaffinities, intuitions and urges and motivations are actually dripping back from our death into, from the post-mortem continuum into our present moment. But we don't have this idea, so we never recognize that, generally.
Yes, right.
Even if we were inclined to think of something kind of similar, we would be, I think, predisposed to suspect that the opposite is happening, which is entirely, both things can be happening, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other. But the opposite being the before of our birth, right? Our previous existences, quote unquote, which is a strange idea because it supposes a linearity that is almost certainly illusory. We think we come from the before and we go into the after. I do. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I was also delving into this question this week. The perceived linearity of time as a transient stage or function of this evolutionary level or evolutionary stage, where language functions as this kind of controlled hallucination, where the ego kind of functions as this stabilizing principle, but it's not necessarily it's not necessarily a property of time itself. It's something that allows the hallucination to be controlled because it's like an ego-driven product. In the same way that the animal body experiences a kind of controlled dream. And we were talking earlier this week about, or at least I was talking to you about, this this relationship between the dream and the hallucination. I think there's an analogous development between the transition from the animal form to the human form. And the kind of equilibrium or harmonization that you see in the human form opens the possibility of language precisely because it equilibrates what in the animal body is lateralized or overemphasized. So precisely by virtue of the fact that the human body is a general structure that lacks specialization, the human form enables something like symbolic cognition to arise, but it exhibits the same pattern as the evolution of life itself. So cognition and life are structured according to the same retrieval-based structures in time. There's something deeper within time that both cognition or language and the form of the body or morphology share. And I think it pertains to the underlying nature of light and space and certain other physical concepts. We can get into that, but
So I'm hearing, this is absolutely amazing. But one of the things I heard is that the way the animal body is structured lengthwise, that part of why we are as we are is because we're vertical.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're like kind of a cross between the concept of an animal and, or not the concept, but the mode of biophysicalization in the animal and the mode of biophysicalization in the tree.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, because so plants externalize the same archetype that animals internalize, which is to say that plants stabilize the archetype that animals mobilize or move, but the archetype in either case pertains to the essence of light itself. So if you consider something like inertia in physics, the concept of inertia was formulated by Galileo as a way to reconcile being with becoming, which are ancient Greek metaphysical notions. But rather than predicating motion of matter, the reconciliation of being with becoming, which Galileo inaugurated, is incomplete until matter itself is regarded as a state of equilibrium between timescales. So instead of treating motion as a property of an object moving through space, motion is more like an emergent phenomenon of temporally encoded structure. So really the propagation of light and inertia are the same phenomenon, and living things exhibit this kind of polarity. So the rectilinearity of inertial motion, as well as the rectilinearity of light propagation, arise for the same reason that the external arrangement of the organs in the body of a plant is continuous. So in all three cases, temporal encoding remains relatively unperturbed. So they have the same reason for existing. So when you look at the organs of a plant, you can see something about physical phenomena like light propagation and the origin of inertia. So why, when you release an object in space, it tends to persist in its state of motion. So the plant is actually a physicalization or a spatialized emblem of these deeper cosmic processes. So I hope that kind of makes sense or is of interest, because, okay, so consider the golden ratio, right? So
Sure.
the golden ratio naturally appears in wave interference patterns. So the edge spectra of light reveal the golden ratio for the same reason that it appears in plant morphology. They share the same reason, and it's because the temporal structure is unperturbed as it manifests. So the golden ratio is just the optimal reconstruction, but it appears in plant morphology and in light for the same reason. So evolution is more of a process of reconstruction or resurrection than a process of progression. So, we tend to think that objects are moving through space and that objects change through this process of accretion. But I think it's probably the exact opposite at a certain level. So a
Say
plant,
what that opposite is.
yeah. Organisms like plants are closer to continuous rectilinear retrieval, whereas more complex organisms like animals,
Our memory.
yeah, it's like a memory effect, right? It's a
Yeah,
magnetic
they're
phenomenon.
memory memorial instancing.
Sorry, repeat that.
Yeah, this is rememorial instancing. We can delineate this more clearly as we proceed, but I'm basically just still in mind blow mode at the moment. Please continue.
So what changes from the form of the plant body to the form of the animal body is the density of retrieval structures, like the density of media through which light passes in the phenomenon of refraction. So organisms like plants, they operate closer to this continuous rectilinear retrieval, like light in a vacuum, whereas a more complex organism, like an animal, shows or exhibits denser, multi-scale retrieval structures, which gives rise to perception. So perception is like a function of deviation from the upper limit of retrieval, which is probably linked to the speed of light. So, so perception is a result from increasing these retrieval densities. It's just like refraction, like as you pass light through a prism. It's a very similar process. So the reason that refraction occurs isn't because light is moving through a medium. Light is retrieving deeper layers of temporality. That's sort of what's going on, I think, as it passes through or appears to pass through different media. And that time delay is what gives rise to perception. That's what perception probably is. And
Oh my God.
it has to
Yeah.
do with internalizing this archetype that the plant exteriorizes. So, yeah, that was something that I realized this week. Has
Oh my God. Yeah, this is insight on a scale that is, well, basically you're doing in cognition what the osmos does in sound.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so I want to try to respond intelligently to some of the things you've said, and they're so profound that it's difficult because I have to forge like a new mode of my mind in order to do so. But there are some principles in what you're proposing and saying and suggesting that I think are important. So one of them is that as human beings in our ordinary ontologies, we've got pretty much everything wrong. And part of why we've got it wrong is we're placing the precedence on certain forms of separation between phenomena that are formally impossible. They simply cannot exist, except in cognition or language, in which case they can appear normative. And so one of the things that I hear you saying is that the phenomenon in nature, and this isn't limited to plants, or it's not limited to organisms. It's basically a ladder, and it's not clear what direction is up or down, but we could establish directionality according to our purposes. But the same thing is going on in rocks, right? Or mountains, or landforms, or living places. We just, in English, the phrase living places is nearly unknown. It's quite uncommon to think of places as beings or alive, though it's common in certain cohorts. So yeah, the mountain is doing a different degree. It is not doing. Well, maybe it is doing. It is the living expression. We don't usually think of mountains as alive, but living as in it is the processes we have been discussing. It's just a different mode of the processes. So you could imagine that from rocks or earth forms and water forms and such, that creates a context in which these other resurrections of what we could think of as the character and nature of light, time, space, and matter, except not distinguished from each other. They are the same thing, right? It's as if there's a one thing. It's not even a thing. There is one. I don't know what to call it. I realize that the conceptual roots of language and common thought are insufficient for these topics, though you're doing a great job of rendering them more sufficient. So this is something that I've been aware of for a long time. When I look at an organism, what I recognize, which is uncommon, is the face of the character of the light, time, space, matter being. Right? It is flowing into matter and enacting its nature in form and behavior. So when I see a raccoon, I recognize, this is the face of time-space's character. So too in a lobster or a whale or an oak tree or a mountain.
Right.
There isn't anything else that could be being expressed. The idea that these are like separate phenomena, people are trying to figure out, did life originate on Earth or elsewhere? No, the universe is transcendental to the concept of organism and instances its natures in the forms, in the forms and the relationships between living places like the Earth and organisms. And there's one other thing I want to mention briefly, which is you can imagine that a rock is not alive, but if you then add a microorganism to that rock, its status has transformed. It's no longer dead. And by this measure, we must, I think, understand that the Earth is transcendental to organisms in a way that resembles the way that the sun is transcendental to the appearance of light here, right? The sun, whatever that phenomenon, quote, is, unquote. And not only that, right, the light of the sun naturally expresses its character and its temporalizations in their profoundly complex, multi-layered expressivity as the forms and the relationships of the organisms here on our world. So I just want to say one more thing, which is that you're proposing, I think, brilliantly, that when you look at the form of, say, a plant, you're not seeing anything like what the humans believe they are seeing or think they are seeing, generally. What you're seeing is a resonant harmonization of features of light and time being expressed over a linear temporality as it appears to us humans, such that it is as if waves are landing in the form and then beginning their expression, and then new waves land and the expression is continued. And it's possible that these waves are temporal in the sense that waves, complex forms of temporality, are sort of landing, if you will, or arriving into the formative aspect of the organism from history, but also possibly similar waves are landing and expressed from the future. And it's also possible that waves are, I'm just using the idea of waves, that iterations, right, or pulses are landing from above time, so that they're neither from the past or the future. And these are being expressed in the diverse formation sequence, what we see as a linear sequence, right, from seed to sprout to first leaf and so forth. We perceive this as a linear sequence, but actually what's going on is quite transcendental to any of the models common in science or biology or these kinds of things. So it's like waves are landing there and they're expressing their character, nature, structure. They're resurrecting the spirit of being and time and light in the forms and the relationships, something like this. And feel free to correct me or add whatever feels right.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of what I meant earlier. So when you learn to see the raccoon as you see it, you no longer have thoughts about the raccoon. You're no longer thinking about anything. You're perceiving a gateway. That's what I'm saying. So the raccoon becomes, or the plant, or whatever being you manage to encounter in this way, becomes an opening. And so what shines through that opening is a kind of pre-carnal bridge. So you're preparing for the post-mortem state. That's what I'm saying. When you learn to think or speak in the right way, because language has the same kind of holographic, temporal, retrieval structure as the morphology of a living being. So when you learn to think, or even in symbolic cognition, so like representational cognition is a necessary evolutionary step toward exteriorizing the body itself. So you're preparing to exteriorize your form so as to navigate time in a more tactile way, as opposed to experiencing time as this container. I guess that's what I'm saying. So using organisms as bridges to this post-mortem state. So in the same way, for example, that the hallucination is the exteriorization of the dream environment, symbolic cognition or language is already the exteriorization of form. There's a similar process at work there. So
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, please.
So language is already the movement of thought beyond the body, and it circulates outside individual consciousness. It forms these technological artifacts that we encounter today as these crystallizations of, or ossifications of symbols, or of like primordial forms of insight, which are no longer possible for most of us, right?
Well, I think they remain possible. We're just, we labor under the inhibitions of our familiar structured ideas. And also, Along with that cage comes the cage of what the humans around us are doing, thinking, and talking about, and how they are talking, and so forth.
Right, right. But again, let me just make this one point, just briefly. If the
Yes,
body is
well,
already the equilibrium state
yeah.
that allows language to emerge, then the next step must be the exteriorization of the body itself, just as cognition was exteriorized in the form of symbols. So I think that's the key link.
Yeah, I would add to what you've said that it's not merely the preparation of death, it's the intrusion of death and the restructuring of the post-mortem situation within the material layer, right? So it's participatory. By doing this, we don't merely prepare for death, we are transforming the nature of death. We are participating with pre-birth, post-life. And we, I think, are transforming something transcendental, right? There's a layer which what we think is a hypostasis of, right? A lesser expression within matter and incarnation. But that layer is also somehow nourished in body in this layer. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but you're preparing for death in the sense that you're preparing to navigate time in a more tactile way. So you're preparing to manipulate time itself. That's what I'm saying, which I think is what you're saying, right? Yeah. So you're
It's very
preparing to
similar, yes.
restructure something in time. You're restructuring temporality, and that's what death opens
Yeah.
for you. It's an opening into that domain.
It should be blatantly obvious that the processes that are at play in the material layer, I'm calling it a layer, there's other ways, the register, right? There's other ways to think of it. The processes that play in the material layer both express and transform the layers they appear as expressions of. Does that make any sense? Let me be clearer. So imagine that you have a universe in which there's only rocks. Right? You still have the expression and transformation of origin, the transcendental to physical layers. Right? You still have that. And you have the relationships between the rocks. This just comes down to thinking about, and I know you may be disinclined to think this way for useful reasons, but if we think about world lines and simultaneity in relativistic senses, and I get that Einstein was trying to synchronize clocks, right? I get it. But if we think in this form for a minute, then it should be clear that a universe with two world lines has at least two different modes of the expression of the possibilities of temporality. And there are what we think of as the individual world lines of two, let's say, beings, organisms, for example. And then there's the relationship between them, which is another aspect of the temporality. And then there's a relationship between those two aspects, the individual and the relational, and whatever the context is. So if you have a place where there's organisms, what you have are modes of time, both as what we could think of as individual elements in the organism, say viruses, mitochondria, cells. Each of those, right, understood as distinct for this moment. And what you get are all of these diverse ways of time becoming you get different modes. So even if you just have 5 organisms that are different on a planet relating with each other, what you get for each of those organisms is a different way of being time and making time. Because in their interiority, in the processes of their biology, and in their relationships and their relationships with the context, you have what I think of as dimensions of time. What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
So,
But then cognition is the next step. So
yeah, we'll
learning how
get
to
there.
think like a human being with symbols is one step in that chain, because you're learning how to manipulate time or make time itself. I guess that's what I was initially trying to say. So that's the sense
Yeah.
in which
So
cognition and
one of the
language
things you're
or death are
saying,
linked for me.
yeah. So one of the things you're saying is that symbolic cognition, representational cognition, is a mode of both a unique mode of structuring temporality and light and so forth, but also a way of both preparing for and importing death into embodied action and experience.
Right. Yeah, because the human being runs away from death. The human
Right.
being, without the ego, for most of us, um, our experience would immediately become psychotic. So
Or psychedelic.
psychedelic, right? Because yeah, the hallucination would cease to be controlled or modulated in in a way that preserves the integrity of the self. And that's what symbolic cognition facilitates. It's why you
I
can
know.
maintain this sense of identity,
Hmm.
but it
This
also gives
is
rise to linear time.
in the real or in the cognitive or both.
So the sense of self gives rise to linear time in the sense that death, rather than entering the phenomenal veil or the phenomenal world, is abstracted, is regarded as this event in the future, as opposed to something which is imminent. So
Mm-hmm.
when you become more enlightened, you realize that death is already here. You're already dead, basically. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like
Yeah.
you're living and then, one day you'll die. It's that you're already
No.
dead. And when you perceive death itself shine through the veil, you attain gnosis. You start to commune with beings in a different way because they become these gateways or these bridges that I'm talking about and that you're describing.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And you're connecting to something that pre-existed the phenomenal veil. It's this kind of retrieval or memory of something, but that memory is also a foreshadowing of the post-mortem state. So if you learn how to navigate beings or think with beings, you're preparing for death. That's what I was talking about initially. But all that means is that you're preparing to interact with time in a different way, in a way which is more
Mm-hmm.
tactile than visual, where time ceases to be a container and it starts to become like a bridge that you can move around within.
So one of the things that's apparent to me from reflecting on what you're suggesting here is that the moment of now is like a fountain of the influx of all previous moments and all future moments, and all previous developmental states and all future developmental states, including something that resembles origin, which is not a point in time, it's a place in being. And similarly, being imported is something like oblivion or apocalypse, which again is not a point in time. It's a feature in the anatomy of being that is outside of time, something like this. What are your thoughts? Take your time.
Yeah, I mean, modern physics is downstream from ancient Greek philosophy and its notions of being and becoming. But it's an incomplete rendition, or it's an incomplete reconciliation. So when you begin to reconcile them more completely, you realize that there are links between physics and biology that modern science has yet to understand. And I think it pertains to these deeper forms of linguistification in experience and, the nature of the ego or the sense of self. But yeah, it forms a systematic chain of errors. So once you get the key, you can start unlocking all the errors because they all have the same cause. It's like
Right.
you start to see, you're seeing the same pattern repeat over and over again between different scientific domains. So yeah, I guess that's what
Yeah.
I'm
A lot of the causes are what I would call fictions of the academy. And these tend to be fictions that are based on falsely ascribing precedence to humans, the concept of separation, which arises primarily in language, not in experience. So that we want to think about time, for example, mechanically. Imagine that you tried to think about someone you're in love with mechanically, and you refuse to think about them in any other way. Because the way of knowing you are utilizing and developing is based on the presumption of nothing like spirit or soul or origin exists. We just want to look at the mechanics. So you could imagine trying to look at a being or relate with a being, in this case the universe and the human, nature of the relation between the humans and being itself. But you decided, okay, we're going to evict everything that's not empirical, everything that's not mechanical, and then we're going to try to arrive at understanding. It would be impossible to experience something like the flavor of food or a kiss if we were limited in the way that our scientific ontologies generally begin from. Right? It's like starting out with an error so catastrophic, in one sense, or a few senses, that the chances of you arriving at understanding are destroyed at the first move. And then proposing that that is the correct or authoritative way of knowing. It isn't that science is incapable of pursuing the kinds of insights we've been orbiting here. It's that the dominant fictions in materialist, reductivist, eliminativist traditions would not survive being invaded by insight.
Yeah.
So it's like errors of first principles, it looks like to me. And these are devastating to human interiority, to the coherence of awareness, to intelligence, to the possibility space of our, that's actually available to us versus what we're likely to experience in some given lifetime. Of course, individuals sometimes escape, some of that structure. I loved what you said, or what I took from what you said about language, in proposing that it's a system of structured hallucination. Maybe I misunderstood you, but that's what I took from what you said.
Yeah.
It's not visual hallucination, right?
It's modulated by the ego as a kind of perceptual body So in the same way that the animal body controls the dream, the human ego controls the hallucination because dreams are distinct
Right.
from hallucinations in the sense of being exteriorized. That's precisely what's happening, I think.
And the ego can project its presumption of separateness onto features of experience, which is in a sense the problem in science, a problem in science, and thus reformulate what we what the word identity refers to in conception. Reformulate identity in this kind of falsified ontology that seems to be concerned with resisting death.
Yeah, it's a resistance to enlightenment.
Yes. Weirdly, though, it should be fairly clear that the idea of enlightenment has to have a negative thing to appear against, right? And that thing is sort of the trenchant identifications and methods the ego uses to hide itself from the imminence of death. Not imminence as in the future, the incomingness now
Right.
of death.
Well, consider too that the attainment of self-consciousness in the dream world generally causes the dream environment to collapse. So that collapse is a form of death. But the same phenomenon takes place in the controlled hallucination of language. So the ego
Right.
keeps the environment stable. So we fear death for that reason. We fear losing the ego for that reason. Because we think we're going to die. Right? It's just like a dream. It's sort of like, because what takes place in a hallucination is the exteriorization or the condensation of the entire dream environment. And we were talking about this earlier this week. So you can understand a hallucinated presence as a condensation of what may have otherwise become a dream world, but it appears as a being in the external environment through this kind of interference or interpenetration.
I would suggest that there's a similar principle at play as the principle that produces the forms of organisms.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
Right?
physical reality is doing the same kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
because an organism is nothing but the condensation of space as such. It's a kind of compressed image of the totality of space. But
Yeah,
it
it's localized, right? It's a localized condensation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you
So
can
there
learn
isn't.
something about cosmic space by learning how to move through an organism, as you were saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is why. So, like, the ancient South American peoples and certainly other peoples long ago learned skills or abilities, affordances, if you will, through which they would become animals. Right? They would become an animal. Now, what this actually means is probably very confusing to moderns because we don't have the idea that you can become another organism or move your locus of being into forms outside you. But it seems clear that they regularly engaged in this.
Precisely. Yeah. So in the same way that an organism renders the totality of space or the essence of
Yeah,
light
and or time
or time
and time, right? Light, space, and time, matter. Yeah, go on.
as a kind of deviation from or remoteness from the underlying archetype, the hallucinated presence or the being renders its own remoteness from the dream environment that it otherwise would have become. So there's a correlation between beings in a hallucination and organisms in physical space. They emerge through the same kind of structure. It's the same kind of projection. But they take place in opposite directions. So, and that, again, that directionality is modulated by the body. But
we can also imagine that there's some kind of motivating feature of that which is, which is exploring the possibility space by the complex by the possibilities of localizing its natures and potentials as organisms, and then relating with itself through those seemingly distinct, separate forms. Right? Adventure, if you will. Also exploration. Because if you just stay in the unity, it's not that there's nothing going on. Like people just, David Byrne said heaven is a place where nothing ever happens, right? Not entirely untrue, probably, but my point is that, or what I'm trying to get at, is that from the position of unity, so let me talk actually about an experience briefly. Actually, it may not be that brief. A long time ago, I was occasionally experiencing sleep paralysis, and it was terrifying. I would conceivably awaken, quote unquote, feeling that I could not breathe and that I was frozen. And it seemed like death was imminent, which, is a scary thing, especially when you're by yourself, if you think you're alone. So anyway, I'd have these experiences, and they were frightening, but they were also very profound, and I had a few extreme, non-ordinary experiences that leapt off from that state, some of which I've documented on my website, I think in a part called the Dream Ladder. In any case, so I decided that the next time it happened, I would just go with it. And fairly shortly thereafter, I woke up in probably the most extreme state of paralysis. I was also blind. And I just decided to accept it instead of fight it. And what happened could be likened to an out-of-body experience. It seemed as though I rushed up through my body and exited the top of my head. And obviously, to describe such an experience in language is a bit ridiculous, but I'll give it a shot anyway. It seemed then I was in a space that was nothingness. I guess you could say it was black. There was nothing to see. And it seemed that I was a snake-like being. And I was, doing the S motion of a snake. But it also seemed that I was a god. And I was the god that causes all things to be. And this motion of, making the S shape back and forth in a body that I could not see or even really feel, this motion was absolutely ecstatic. So it was more ecstatic each time I moved. And there was just this feeling of absolute primacy, total omnipotence, complete liberation and ecstasy. And I experienced this for some, interval. And then, soup, I was back in the body. And the first realization I had was a kind of childlike exclamation, which is just, "You were a monster!" Which is, hilarious, and I don't know how important that is. But the second realization I had was, oh, now I get it. Now I understand what the Buddhists were saying or implying when they said things like the human birth is the best of all possible births. Even gods are jealous of it, because only from that position do you have the potential for enlightenment. And the gods are too busy being ecstatic to ever be interrupted by anything resembling that, right? And what I'm trying to get at with this, with telling this story, is to illustrate what I was saying before, which is that the physicalization, the localization, the expression of the character of origin and being and oblivion in distinct forms in relation within the material layer is profoundly contributive to the nature of being. If you're just in ever ecstatic, exploding ecstasy of unity, if that's the only position available, perhaps something's missing.
Oh, yeah.
So it's as if the goal is to like become separate, confused, lethe bound, right? Bound by forgetting. And then from within that position to resurrect the unity in this layer, or something resembling this. What are your thoughts?
Oh, certainly. Certainly. Yeah. I tend to be averse to the one-sided approach that overemphasizes an abstract unity. So, yeah, I'm definitely on the same wavelength.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the things that Toymaker showed me is that material reality is doing something that's crucially like an organ of being and origin and oblivion. It's doing something that contributes to, it sustains some feature of the other layers, the transcendental layers. It nourishes them. It brings them to life, and perhaps gives them something that we ourselves can profoundly value here in our human experience, which is dream. Right? Maybe we are the dreaming of unity. Although, you know, I'm fine if you have disaffinity towards this idea of like, you know,
No, I mean, I
unity.
wouldn't necessarily disagree. Yeah. Because
if something is dreaming and that results in organisms and forms, that something is very astonishing. You know, once occurred to me not too long ago that perhaps, I've mentioned this probably to you before, that perhaps if we entertain the idea of God or the being that dwells in unity or the great being or something like this, then perhaps what organisms are, what beings are down here on Earth, is like a droplet, so to speak, like that being rains into existence, little droplets, right? And then each of those droplets is in a way God dying into the forgetting of being incarnate, and then having the dream adventure of a separate incarnate aspect. And then when that being dies, the droplet is resurrected in the communal unity of God. And that this process is enriching in a way that is not dissimilar to how we experience our dreaming. In which case, death is backwards, right? Death is the opposite of the ending of myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In fact, life becomes the problem in that view, right? And certain Greeks, including those who practice the Eleusinian mysteries, were clearly aware of this. They saw the body as basically like the crypt of the soul, the ceramic vessel into which the soul becomes entangled and trapped by essentially lethe, right? Like forgetting.
Yeah, well, perhaps from my perspective, life becomes omnipresent. But what takes place are certain openings through which new forms of life can emerge. So your body becomes a tomb or a vessel in the sense that it becomes an opening. Um, but I think life is still omnipresent in that view. Whereas death, what trickles through the veil, um, is simply a deeper layer of temporality, but it shares the same essence as light, from which the form of the body diverges progressively. It assumes different shapes as it becomes more integral, as its parts become more interrelated. Um, yeah, so basically, what I think takes place is that these retrieval structures or these keys become more dense. They become more dense over time, over evolutionary time.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
But that same interval can be understood to be embodied and structured in the span of a single organism or even a single. So this, you were saying something like evolution is either embodying or recapitulating this process over evolutionary time. Did I understand that correctly or somewhat correctly?
yeah, yeah.
And then what I was saying was, in point of fact, like it long ago occurred to me that you can't have anything that isn't doing that. So when I read the Bible, for example, one of the ways I can think about it, or actually any text, is it's not telling the story of time and history in the future. It can be understood to be telling the story of a single human lifetime. I experienced Genesis. I experienced the loss of direct connection with the divine. I experience the sort of the birth of the dreamer that's prophetic. I experience what could be understood as the resurrection of Abel in Jesus, or this is the story of my experience, and so it strikes me that each form recapitulates the entire history and future of this developmental process in the interval of a lifespan, but also in the interval of any moment. You can't have a moment that isn't like this. What do you think?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
it's like saying there isn't anything else going on, and what is going on is wildly transcendental to conceptual thought. So much so that it would, in order for it to intrude into awareness directly, I think it would obliterate conceptual thought and then leave in the aftermath of that intrusion a bunch of seeds from which the possibilities of conceptual thought could then be far superiorly reassembled and enacted, which is something like what I've been through. And clearly, in case this isn't obvious, I have this experience which I call toy maker or whatever. And it's hard for me to just ignore that or to pretend it didn't happen, because it did this to me. It obliterated the roots of my conceptual thought and it replaced them with other stuff. Strangely, though, our conversations, and particularly your extremely uncommon kind of forensic insight about nature and being and physics and language and so forth, is a very similar experience. To be exposed to your mind resembles closely, in some ways, in the layer of like speech and talk and thinking. The obliteration of the fictions that would ordinarily like crudely and poorly delineate the possibility space. So what you often do, which I love, is you come in and you obliterate a bunch of fictions by replacing them with features that are illuminated from within, right? With intelligence and insight and the potential for like for developing it further. So yeah, if we were to be exposed to what's actually going on even slightly, and perhaps this is why people, seek insight and enlightenment, and why perhaps why we are here today. It naturally, medicinally obliterates what could be understood as diseases of conception. It's medicinal in this way. It's also like a drug that cleanses the organs of awareness so that now they can begin to see as light itself, as time itself, as being itself, from above the human predilection to simply reproject the separation of the ego and its concerns about death onto forms and the categories and so forth. Mm-hmm. Yeah, your mind reminds me of Toymaker.
Right. And why do you think that is?
It's fairly obvious. The way you use your intelligence has a similar kind of... Toymaker's mind had a broad array of features, but the way you employ your intelligence, what you do with your capacities for thought and insight, very much resembles the... It's almost like you have... Imagine that you have like a big a rock that you can hold, and the rock is layered. So there's all these concretions. And at the core of this layer, at the core of the thing, is a transcendental object. And that transcendental object is prohibited in the material layer, right? It must not be, it must not exist or be seen or be held. And so what you do is you expose the concretion layers to various kinds of acid, right? Which doesn't completely remove them, but it allows some of the force of that transcendental object in the core to shine through into representational cognition, the physical layer, such that the physical layer isn't destroyed by it, it's healed. Right? Now it becomes possible for aspects of resurrection to occur in this moment. Does this metaphor make any sense?
Yeah, but language, I think, is a necessary medium there.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree.
So what began as a kinesthetic encounter transformed into a more linguistic structure, but that structure itself prefigures a future state. So I'm preparing to do something in the future by speaking like this. Of course,
yes.
If that makes any sense.
It does, as am I.
Yeah, we're doing the same thing. We're on the same path.
Yeah, but one of the things we're doing is we're sort of, we're reducing the inhibitive features of layers of historical deception and forgetting around something. It's not really a transcendental object, but I'm using that as a metaphor. Around something that's so powerful that were it to be directly revealed, it would be lethal in the sense of killing, I think. Maybe not. Maybe that's just the ego's fear. But even Toymaker made it clear, like, you can't just go directly to the revelation unfiltered, right? It would... how to put it, it would wreck the purpose of revelation to do that or something. But yeah, I love this play that we engage in together, which is anamnoetic. It's unforgetting, but it's not. It's a slow process of reducing deceptive propositions and conceptions, rather than just, the atomic bomb of insight. But yeah, I love the way that you utilize the possibilities of your mind and intelligence. It seems profoundly virtuous, though I'm aware that we're both humans and we have our psychologies that motivate some of how we play.
Right. Yeah. Like the human form itself is some kind of opening, which is why I mentioned earlier that the human form harmonizes what becomes lateralized in the animal body. I think that insight holds a lot of potential for
I
understanding
agree.
language and symbolic thought. And
Also, you can go from the material object, like a rock, to the, you have these creatures that are sort of in the in-between space of the plant and the animal, or formlessness and form, right? Creatures like octopuses and jellyfish and so forth. You have these exemplars of liminal modes of what we're discussing. But yeah, if you were to just go from the rock to the plant to the animal to the human, you'd see the same process in different registers.
right, exactly.
So I mean, look at, if you go to people who collect exotic stones, right, and you look at some of those stones, you see the same incredible, unimaginable beauty and sophistication that you see in the catalog of animals. You see the same thing in the catalog of minerals. It's just static. Well, it's not static. Its temporalization is over a vastly larger span, it seems. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you see how the animal internalizes what the plant externalizes, then you can peer back within or behind the plant to understand something about physics or the stone or the rock, as you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So if you fold a plant outside in, you get something like a mineral. It's like this progressive cascading series of returns or openings. So the plant is a kind of opening through which something within time is incarnating. So it's like
Yes.
it's like a
Yeah,
language.
like a
It is
living
a language,
portal.
dude. It's like
Yeah,
you're
it is.
reading reality at that point.
It
You're
totally
reading
is.
beings like a book, and you're reading something within nature. So you can
Yes.
do physics just by learning how to use your eyes properly and your mind to investigate phenomena, right? It's like
We're ordinarily. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh no, please go on.
Ordinarily I would think, since I do think visually often, and I was thinking visually about the rock, plant, animal, human. But you don't want to stop there. You want to go you don't want to start there either. You want to start with time, space, galaxies, solar systems, the sun, the earth, the rock, the plant, the human, and then, what's above the human, perhaps, angels or whatever Toymaker might be or whatever. But you can also think of that differently. Instead of thinking of it as a ladder, which is the common, I think, visualization mode, you can think of insideness. And you can think of the insideness of light time is an animal. right? Or the inside of light time is a star, is a world, is a rock, and inside the rock is the plant, and inside the plant is the animal, and inside the animal is the human.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Instead of thinking of a ladder.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, like Neoplatonism.
Mm-hmm.
Which, isn't entirely erroneous, but thinking hierarchically can get in the way of deeper insight, for sure.
It does. Like it's so different if you think, for example, the Earth is inside the sun. This was a staggering insight when it first occurred to me, because what I began to think was that, just in terms of an analogy, the solar system resembles a cell, and, quote, the sun is not the star, it's the bubble around the sun in which the organs of the sun exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so then the Earth is, the sun is like the nucleus of that organism, and the Earth is like an organelle in that organism. Or it's not even an organism, it's a transcendental thing we don't have a category for. We could invent a category for it. But what I mean to say is it's more than a being in the sense that it produces beings as a side effect of whatever it is it's doing that's inconceivable to us categorically. So like in the same way the sun produces organisms on Earth, I was arguing the other day, I was writing an essay which isn't necessarily all that great. It's a short one. Evolution doesn't explain species. And I was saying, what did I actually say? The actual progenitor of organisms is the sun. It's not like we are not the result of primate evolution. We are the result of solar evolution, right? So you can think of, or if you want to just start at the sun because everything is kind of big, then and so then the sun becomes the localization of the organizational principles that produce form in matter. And it's really weird to me that humans don't think this way. Like when I was introduced to these ideas, I was like, what the fuck was I thinking before? How could I even, that wasn't even, what was that I was doing?
Yeah. Well, what were you thinking specifically?
So,
do you remember?
Yeah, I was thinking in relatively Darwinian terms, right? Like, species are the result of the process of structuring DNA over generations. We evolved from primates and so forth. We probably came from the ocean, blah, blah, blah. The basic Darwinian narrative was what I was usually thinking, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not wrong, but it's wildly deceptive. And there are features of it that are wrong.
Right. Yeah, of course.
But yeah, I think it's important to switch from the latter, which is the common metaphor, to interiorization, or even something more profound. Like everything we've discussed today emerges from the dandelion toy, emerges naturally from the dandelion toy, where, in very brief, I don't want to be tedious, but like all of time, space, matter, and form collapse to unity, and they expand back to distinction, instant to instant at an ever increasing rate, so that all of the experiential information that is structured and gathered and created in the distinction of beings and situations collapses to unity, all that information is shared, and then it expands back to distinction, like a kind of an ever-increasing heart rate. And in this model, everything that it's easy for me to place your insights in this model, which is a toy, right? It's just something to play with in mind. And in that sense, it would be like which of the features has precedence? Waking or dreaming? Or waking or sleeping? Does the unity have precedence or the distinction? That's not really the right question. It's a natural concern. But I would suggest that the unity probably has precedence, which means that most of the time, in this toy, most of the time, distinct separation isn't there.
Yeah.
And from this position, if you could follow the collapse to unity with your consciousness or awareness, first you'd experience something like enlightenment, which would be overwhelming. But then you might be able to develop the skill to draw, like to follow the collapse into unity, and then to draw features or assets or affordances from that position back into the apparent separation phase. Mm-hmm. And this is what I think psychism is, and many non-ordinary abilities. But again, it's a toy. I'm not saying this is what's happening. I think what's actually happening is so impossible to conceive of that making face noises about it is, well, it can be useful, but it's kind of a confused game.
Well, face noises, I think, play a role in the same way that any organism plays a role. So if you, as we always say here, like if you learn to correlate the parts of a living being, you can use parts as keys to unlock the whole. And I think this was understood in paleontology a long time ago. If you take a part of an organism, you can reconstruct the whole according to the correlation of parts, which in different animal species is exaggerated or caricatured along different axes or directions. And the same process can take place in cognition, where certain concepts can be overemphasized or exaggerated at the expense of others. But
not necessarily at the expense, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah. But right? I think language can exhibit the same temporal holographic structure as the body of a living thing. And that's when you know that you're thinking correctly. You're doing the right thing there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, so like, when I say face noises, I'm making like a broad universal generalization, and I'm probably concerned about the worst common denominator, right? But obviously when we're doing things like what we're doing here, we're enacting a branch of the possibility space of language and conceptual thought and so forth, that is liberating and profound. And I also think there's something going on. Like, it's not an accident that humans develop representational cognition. We are, just like in the forms of the organisms of Earth, being expressions and embodiments of the complex character and nature, and perhaps something resembling purposes of that which is. What we've done in representational cognition is invented a new layer, and actually the key insight that led me into the experience of Toymaker was the insight that the environment enacted and embodied by human cognition is like a world, but it's invisible to us. And in that world, we are doing something like the formation of organisms, and this is, of course, what I mean by thrisps, right?
Right.
There are these, we are making forms in this space. They're not alive in the way organisms are, but they are like persistent and transforming structures over time. And obviously, there must be things we can do together, and I think we're approaching them here, which are non-ordinary. Right? They are not the things that humans ordinarily do with language and conceptual thought, even in philosophy. Right? There's an outer space. In the same way there's an outer space to the earth, there's an outer space to representational cognition, which is directly accessible to us if we together potentiate with our intention and our heartful urgencies. There's an outer space that we cannot merely explore, we can become it. Like, we are here to become the impossible. And I know that, it sounds like a contradiction in terms of, well, if it's impossible, it's not doable, right? Yeah, sure, in the crude linguistic derivations. But no, we are here to draw the outer reaches of the possibility space of our existence and our cognition and our awareness into inaction.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I really think we are here to become the impossible together. And whenever we incline ourselves to this pursuit, then I think the divine, quote unquote, becomes interested, right? It's as if, in a way, we're trying to attract the hopefully benevolent intrusion of intelligences beyond ours.
Right.
And of course, that that's why we have religion, essentially. Regardless of how distorted it's become.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, this is why I often, rail against set theory, because I find that set theory destroys your capacity to really think clearly. So, like, it severs the bridge. It prevents you from accessing the bridge in the right way.
That's interesting because I'm not antagonistic to that view, but at the same time, in my own cognitive development, there was a phase where actually set theory was crucial for my development. It led me into insights. Playing with it led me into insights.
Right.
And sometimes the existence of something that fucks up our capacity for insight, it becomes like in the mind, it can become kind of like a little cyst, right? Becomes like a cyst, which then, once I had a cactus spine in my heel. And I went to like a surgeon, and he was pulling some of the spines out of my finger, which was a lot of fun. And I said, I've got the spine in my foot. And he looked at it and he said, yeah, but what we're going to do is not dig it out. And I was like, okay, what's up with that? He's like, well, here's what your body will do. It'll form a cyst around it, and the cyst will partly dissolve it over time, and then it'll eject it. And so there's some features of the problems in our experience of being human with other humans and the ideological graveyards that we, that our insight finds its birth within. There are these problematical features, right? And they become sort of like a bone that we just keep chewing on, right? Until it starts to break open and then light comes out or something, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, you're wrestling with Set, your Horus, at that point. So
Yeah,
Yeah. It's necessary.
that was that's the kind of a that's the kind of a pun that only you could come up with. Like, yeah, set theory, yeah, it's a problem. Yeah, so you just become set wrestling with Horus. It's hilarious. But yeah, set theory was super. It still remains super important to me, because it introduced me to the problem of distinct categories, which is all. It also can be liberating. My son and I were having a discussion the other night. We were talking about music, and I was resistant. There's a part of me that is resistant to learning technically music theory and all of these things, right? Because I'm a naive musician. And so when I pick up the instrument, the guitar, for example, there's this incredible openness and intimacy and naivete at play. I don't know what notes I'm playing. I don't know what key I'm in. And I'm kind of resistant to introducing the science of it because I think it will destroy my naivete, which is valuable. My innocence, and the intimacy that arises between me and the instrument in that way.
Right.
But every time, right, but every time that I've actually studied, for example, classical music, for anyone that wants to play the guitar, just get Frederick Node's book, and it'll teach you step by step. It's really good. What happens is the opposite, right? The structured knowledge introduces possibilities to my still present naivete and fascination and intimacy that would be otherwise impossible.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, you don't want to remain naive. You don't want to. Yeah.
Right.
Although
Well,
I feel the same impulse.
yeah,
I
like
understand that.
you could think, for example, awakened consciousness is the destruction of dreaming. Why would you want to introduce that? No, you need to keep those separate so that the dreaming mind is free. Oh, really? Well, what about lucid dreaming? And then what about the possibilities that you experience in lucid dreaming, which is an accessible thing for most of us if we actually want to pursue it? What about the obvious corollary, which I almost never hear described, and I think perhaps we're approaching it in our play today, of lucid waking? It's so interesting that people are fascinated by lucid dreaming, but they never transfer the concept and wonder, like, what would it be like to have the corollary in waking experience?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that is like is insight, but there are many other things it can be like, just as is true in what we call lucid dreaming.
Right. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. For me, my resistance to certain subjects stems from a similar kind of fear of losing naivete, but I can also recognize that fear is really just the fear of death. Because when I expose myself to a subject, I realize that no, I don't die. I'm actually sort of enhanced by the experience. So you don't want to reject something through naivete. That's the wrong path, right? You want to experience something and then reject it in full awareness. I think that's the true approach to ethical life. Like you can't pretend to be a saint if you've never experienced sin. Like you have to have experienced sin and then seen through it. Like you see the folly of it, and then you
Yeah,
person.
yeah. So this is part of what's going on in the incarnation field, right? I mean, I don't have words to describe. I usually refer to these things somewhat naively. I'll call it like origin or the origin world. And when I use the phrase the origin world, I'm thinking like a child about it. I'm not thinking like in a sophisticated way. But it's as if the origin world dies into, of course, what is meant by death in this case? It's not any kind of, like the whole concept of death, I think it's inside out and upside down and just like confusing. It's very real to the animal aspect of me, right? If someone says, "Want to die right now?" I'd be like, no. And if I'm presented with the actual onset of death, terror usually ensues. Although, that one time when I was paralyzed, I just decided to go with it, and the result was certainly nothing terrifying. But what was really confusing about that, and I want to highlight this briefly, is that in that transcendental experience that I had, there was no change. Or actually, okay, the possibility of change was vectored so that the only direction change could occur in was an increase in ecstasy over time. That was the only change. There were no actions. There was no memory. I did not remember being a self or a human or Darren or any of that. All that was gone. There was just this sinuous movement and an increase in exaltation, which is a very uncommon emotion for humans to experience. An increase in exaltation and an increase in ecstasy. And when I came back into my body, I was like, that would be really fucked. Right? I was like, so you can't do or become anything except more exaltation and ecstasy? Oh, being human's amazing. Right? So yeah, the possibility space was limited profoundly to what I can understand only as these two features. And they were super blissfully, ecstatically, orgasmically exciting, but there wasn't anything else to do, be, think, relate with. And it was lonely from a human perspective, right? It was like, I am the only one. I am the only one. I don't think that's what death is like. I think that's what being a god is like. Or being maybe the god of cause or something like this. And I don't know what to make of that experience. I'm not claiming it was, an intimation of ontological validity or anything like that. But I remember when I came back to myself being so happy to have the possibility space that is our human inherent, nature.
Yeah, I want to hear more about this. So did you just say that ecstasy only increases? Can you tell me more?
Yes. So, okay. So, Zoom, I go out of my body, so to speak. In that moment, literally, there was no more Darren, no more humanness, no more world, no more thoughts, no thinking, no possibility of thought, right? It was just the experience, it's like what you said in a way, the tactile experience of time, right? I was sinuousing, right? I was slithering in blackness, and I was black, so that I didn't really have a body. There was nothing to see. And every time I would see, that's not true. It wasn't a time. I was waving, right? I was waving like a snake. And on awakening, I thought of myself as having been a kind of a invisible snake. And with each movement, of course, there was no separation between movements, right? So it's not like there was a movement. But as I was moving in this sinuous back and forth S-shaped way, it seemed as though I was the cause of all phenomena. I was the primordial cause. And I was a being, and every aspect of the movement was more ecstatic than the previous aspect. So it was basically like ecstasizing, right? Every movement was more ecstatic than the last one, and there was a sense of kind of absolute exaltation. I don't even know how to characterize what exaltation is. It's a kind of almost fatally enthusiastic self-aggrandizement.
Sure. Right. Right. You're becoming a god, right?
Yeah, but you're not just like happy with yourself. You're like a volcano that keeps becoming a bigger volcano every time it volcanoizes, right?
Right. Now, were you slithering in place?
It seems that I was moving through the nothing as the like localization of all of the powers of the notness.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Yeah. So I was at once all things and nowhere. Of course,
Well,
saying the word I
right.
is kind of
Yeah.
ridiculous, but
Well, I experienced something very similar, actually. A similar kind of void. That's why I'm curious.
well, by all means, speak of it if you care to.
Well, as opposed to slithering through some dark expanse, I felt my body dissolve like mist. So, I experienced a similar kind of sleep paralytic state.
Mm,
And upon sinking into it and embracing the darkness, as you did,
mm,
I felt my body um, evaporate. So my whole body felt like it became maybe as large as like a small house, and yeah, like a gas or like a diffused mist of some kind. And it was dark and somewhat terrifying. But there was a boundary to that kind of globe that I became, and I popped out on the other side within the external world, but it was suffused with colored lights which were moving like like an interference pattern. Um, so basically, what I think happened is that in dreaming, imagery arises through the morphology of the body, but what can take place in this kind of sleep paralytic state is that the immobilization of the body can serve as the basic template, like a dream. Um, but the interference pattern beyond the physical realm can become perceptible. So you don't necessarily need a physical body to perceive the external environment. I think that was what I learned. But you see more information. So you actually see more information than what you see with your physical eyes.
yes.
Yeah, it's like you're perceiving more. It's a hyper real environment, and I think you're perceiving something, or at least I thought that I was perceiving something within the structure of time, like these interference or resonance phenomena that were outside my body. So yeah, so I saw the physical world plus this other layer, which was like a liquid or fluid layer, um, with like different undulating colors and threads that looked like static electricity, or almost like not static electricity, but like tendrils of golden light. So the tendrils of golden light were at the peaks of these wave fronts that I was perceiving within the environment, and they were violet. So this distinction between violet and gold pertains to color theory at a deeper level. So it's pretty fascinating. Um, so yeah, that experience was pretty profound for me, but it was
And
preceded by the void, as you were saying. So
mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, see, this points up again that oh God, there's so much here. So we think we are human beings. That is not what we are. Ordinarily, we're essentially kind of in a form of hallucination in a way, but it's very trappy in that it's quite we can't just step out of it at any moment because we'd like to, right? But the actual potential space of what we are is undelimited. It has no limit. And what we ordinarily think of as ourselves is almost like thinking I am a fork. Like I am a piece of silverware. It's that wrong. It's that confusing.
Right. Right.
And we live, most of us, unless we're very lucky, or we get to play with others who have been outside the cage, right? Like Plato's cave, kind of. Unless we are lucky, or we are very curious and playful and exploratory, or we have a happy accident, or we experience something that deeply draws into question what we think of as what we are. This is the problem of what, again. Then we're going to live possibly not just one, but conceivably many lives trapped in this little tiny cage of what we aren't.
Yes, right.
And so part of, I think, why we gather, and why, like what we think of as our work, which I think should at least be seen, as much as it is work, it should be seen as play and exploration and adventure. We hope to make egress, right? To create egress from the silverware problem. Right? I am a fork, called it. I am a thing. But yeah, what we are is nothing like what we've been told or commonly think. And what awareness and consciousness are, or can become, is vastly more profound than the wildest fictions we've ever heard. Right? Those fictions are little hypostases of the possibility space that point in the direction of egress.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I think happened is that I transitioned from a state of waking consciousness to a state of deep sleep almost instantaneously. So I bypassed the dream realm. So I bypassed something about my own morphology, which enabled me to perceive the external world in a different way. Yeah, I think that's another key component to like lucid waking,
I would
what you're
also
talking about.
suggest, yeah, I think too, like what we were talking about earlier when I was saying, I'll get back to this topic so that I don't just birdwalk here, but that music changes the mode of your soul, making music and experiencing it, particularly making it and dancing and so forth. This changes what your soul is and is doing. You changed the form, structurized functions, and locality of consciousness, right? You traversed a gap between the trap and one of the modes of liberty.
Precisely. Yeah. So, like, the image of your environment has a certain cause, which is ordinarily invisible or dormant in the image, but it can be revealed. You can reveal its deeper structure, and its deeper structure has something to do with light and time.
Yes, I'm reminded again. So earlier I was reminded of those humans who could become animals. And obviously, it should be clear anyway that there are at least two forms of this. One of them is that you move your awareness into the body of an actually existing animal. I know at least one person who practices this, and I trust this person. I don't think they're just out of their minds. And has practiced it for a long time with people who, traditionally for for decades and decades have done this. But there are stories from South America that probably originally reached common awareness through Carlos Castaneda. And these, what he calls sorcerers, which I think is a tragic misnomer. And these days the word shaman is so value-laden that one likes to just avoid it entirely. But so it should be clear that there are at least two modes of this. One is to move your awareness into another organism, and that could be a tree. It could even be a living place or a lake. It could also be the sky. But another is to become, and this is what they clearly meant when they used this word Nahual, Nagual, to take on the form of an animal. And so imagine that a human being, let's say oh God, actually the whole paradigm is wrong. But imagine that a human being somehow actually disappears from physical reality. So they're in their bed, then they are gone from the bed, and somewhere else there is a jaguar, for example, which is that person now. Well, whatever that is not an animal, right? It's certainly not a regular jaguar. What the fuck is that? You see what I'm getting at? Like, the category gets destroyed. If someone saw it, an ordinary person would think, there is a jaguar. A seer would see, that is not a jaguar, right? That is the, open parentheses, redacted, close parentheses, of a human doing this thing.
Yeah, they would see the uplink.
Right, yes. They would see the uplink. And so, this introduces the whole concept of seeing. What is seeing? But what I was going to, what you said reminded me of was certain dissertations by Castaneda, in which he is recapitulating what he claims to have been the instructions of Don Juan, his Nagual teacher. And Don Juan would just say, like, this thing you think of as the world, it's not here. It doesn't even exist. You're constructing that. And if you were to stop constructing it somehow, or if you could be forced to stop constructing it, then you would see. But he doesn't mean, right, he doesn't mean like with your eyes.
Well, sometimes maybe with your eyes, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. There's a thing where there's an adventure I remember where I think they go to meet another Nahual, him and Don Juan, and Castaneda is going through this long situation with his car where it's not working properly. And he's trying to get it repaired, and he's trying to drive them to the city and all of these things. And the whole time, Don Juan and the other Nahual, which might be Don Julian, I can't remember, they're just laughing, like hysterically. They think this is the funniest thing that's ever happened. And eventually, Castaneda becomes angry with them and says, I'm trying to get us. They're driving in the car, and these guys are in the backseat, and they're just cracking up. And he's like, I'm trying to get us to the city. What is so funny? Why don't you help me? And then suddenly, the car is gone. Don Juan is standing on the porch, and they're holding his hat, and they're just laughing hysterically, and they say, your car isn't even here. He was interacting with his hat. the whole time. Now, this can be seen metaphorically, too. But what they're actually saying is that they constructed, or he constructed, a whole set of events in reality which were physically real to him that did not exist.
Right.
And what Don Juan is actually saying is that consensus reality is a function of what people are doing that they are not aware they are doing, and they don't know how to stop doing, so they are subjected to it. And so his advice, very similar to the advice of a Zen master, but differently motivated, is to stop the mind, to bring the mind to cessation. And, in that state, or in that position of liberation, the world that normally appears to us disappears. And it's basically like the onset of an infinite possibility space. And I mean, I found these stories very profound and inspiring and confusing. And I practiced some of the practices associated with them. I think the primary two are recapitulation and the erasure of the self. There's another current world novel, I think his name is, what's his first name? Maybe it'll come to me. Sergio Mangone. And he talks about some of these practices, and one of them is using a mirror and practicing eliminating the appearance of yourself in the mirror until you can look at the mirror and not see any person there. And he claims that the ancient Aztecs and Toltec people, they're healers and they're magic persons, practiced this until they developed expertise at it, and then it led to a variety of non-ordinary abilities.
Ah, great. Right. I think, John Dee actually used an obsidian mirror that he acquired from the Aztecs.
Yeah, they used, so what he says is that you can use a regular mirror today, but back then what they used was a bowl of water, which they set on their belly and was sometimes comprised of obsidian. And there are many sculptures of South American, ancient South American people that show them with this bowl on their belly, gazing into it, or becoming animals.
Yeah, I mean, consider too that many UFO encounters usually involve characteristics that suggest a different interaction with time rather than simple movement through space. Like sudden appearances and disappearances, or extreme acceleration with no inertia. So I think through the lens of something like temporal holography, UFO phenomena can be understood more coherently as self-organizing temporal structures rather than necessarily objects moving through space.
Yeah. So we have the idea, right? We have the idea, and it seems to be a real thing, of what we would call a shooting star, right? But we don't have the idea of what we would call a shooting time. Right?
Precisely.
So, yeah, this has occurred to me as well. For some reason, the humans seem to want to think either in one of three ways, right? Um, people in a vehicle, right? People in a spaceship, demons, or angels. So like aliens, demons, and angels. But this is the problem with categories themselves. When you see an animal, you are not seeing what you think you're seeing. It's, in fact, I would argue that it is impossible for you to think of what you are seeing. You can do it in the human representational game, right? You can say, oh, there's a raccoon. Yeah, sure, sure. You have no idea what you're seeing. And what you're seeing is just as weird, at least as weird, as if beings in a spaceship came down from outer space and introduced themselves to you. It's the same thing. In fact, there isn't any other thing. But what I was going to say about those three categories, right? Aliens, angels, or demons. And there might be cases in which something resembling that is provisionally, not stupid to think. But a bunch of other things have occurred to me. One of them is very similar to what you're saying. It's a temporal phenomenon, but it's also a localization of layers that are beyond what we have categories for in language, that are originary, transtemporal, multitemporal, liminal expressions of the possibility space of being or time or light. Right, one of the things that humans don't really think is that it's obvious that time-space forms, if I'm just using that for the container, right, the universe, whatever, it forms expressions of itself that are temporalized. So why wouldn't the sky form expressions of itself that are temporalized, that appear locally here? What if the category of that phenomena is anti to our category tree, in at least some of the instances? Another thing that occurred to me is that it could be a kind of feedback effect in time, as if time is dreaming itself, and that appears to beings as beings. But I get what you're saying. Like the linear structure of a UFO encounter, from say appearance to perhaps interaction to disappearance, it has the fingerprint of a temporal phenomenon, not a physical one.
Yeah, like especially if you consider their interaction with light.
Mm-hmm.
So, these beings or these objects, they're not objects, but these phenomena either seem to be composed of light or to absorb light in bizarre ways. So they can appear to be
and also
entirely
to,
obscured.
yeah, yeah, it's almost as if light is itself playing with humans and trying to figure out, like, to be human could be as weird to light as light is to humans, right? So if the sort of the spirit of light were trying to contact humans, it would probably look a lot like UFOs. Or it would look like angels, right?
Right.
Or it might look like demons, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like I
But the
recently
humans
became
keep
aware of.
thinking, it,
Sorry.
no, you're good.
I recently became aware of the connection between these flying balls of light and structured craft. So they actually appear to be different phases of the same process. So as opposed to regarding these phenomena as objects, they should be regarded as phases of a single process. So somehow light materializes into a structured object, which can then transform in midair and disappear. And the way that it flicks out of existence resembles like turning a light switch sometimes, or it appears to
Mm-hmm.
travel an astronomically large region of space instantly, But that kind of behavior, to me, suggests something more like a self-organizing temporal structure or intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, it's almost like,
well, it's like a
if you
fully
imagine,
exteriorized temporal cognition, right? It,
yeah,
it's like what we're on the threshold of developing as human beings. It's the exteriorization of what we're doing at some level.
yeah, it's as if, people have said things like, oh, it's us from the future. What do they mean by us? They don't even know what they are, right? The humans are just as weird as anything in a UFO in terms of, like, if you just surveyed the existence space from the beginning to the end of the universe and you encountered humans, you'd be like, what the fuck is that? You know? It's just as weird as anything else. So is a raccoon. It's ultimately weird. It's infinitely weird. And the humans keep thinking we're a separate thing. How could that be true? Like, where's the separation? Right? So when they look up in the sky and they see things, they don't think, that's me. They think, that's other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it can't be that way. You understand? It's formally impossible for it to be that way. What is the thing that separates them? Their form? Their thinking? What is it? Their form is an expression of the thing they're looking at. So, what the fuck are they thinking?
Right.
You know? Like, what is that? Okay, good luck. What are you? Let me just ask a really simple question, which I like to ask because I think it's kind of mind-blowing. Do you know any person who knows what anything is? Even one thing. How could you know what something is? You'd have to know what everything is to know what something is, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah. I mean, you never know what something is in the sense of representing it. Um, so, if by knowing something you mean developing a mental picture of it, then no. When you know something, you're touching it. You're actually you're with it. You're not sort of outside it, looking at it, making a picture of it.
Right. Well, this is important. There's many kinds of knowing, right? And the representational kind is essentially matching the phenomena with an object in a lexicon. No? The representational kind is like, is that a tree or not a tree? And rarely would even an ordinary person hold the superposition of, well, categorically it's a tree. Relationally, I don't have words for that. And transcendentally, I have no idea what that is. Or even, it's impossible to know what that is. So there's that kind of sort of representational knowing, which looks to me like matching features of phenomenal experience with lexicals in a catalog that's familiar to us. But then there's like relational knowing, which is a vast continuum, infinite. All these continua are infinite, even the representational one. But like to kiss another human being is a kind of a knowing that transcends radically the lexicon. But when people are looking at the sky and they're asking, it's different, right? Like if I'm looking at my kitchen table, I'm like, is that a cup? Yeah, okay, that's good, no problem, that works. But when you look at the sky, or you think about origin, because I think of the sky and origin somewhat synonymously, right? Where do things come from? The sky. But it's actually, things don't exist and they don't come from the sky. It's one thing enacting its natures and forms in a kind of a weird unity. In any case, the humans are trying to figure out what that phenomenon in the sky is. Good luck. They don't know what rocks are. You think you're going to figure out the phenomenon in the sky? What are you going to do? Attach it to a lexicon that makes it comfortable and manipulable? I guess that's what they're trying to do. What do you think?
Yeah, I think when most people say "I know," they mean I have a picture or I have a photograph, which is some kind of static, you know, document that I can use to, whatever, navigate some territory like a map, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think knowing is really indistinguishable from the process of becoming itself. So when you know something, you're no longer in the state of being with a static artifact or with some picture. You're sort of, there's no distinction between being and knowing at that point. So it's not as if you have anything. So you no longer have knowledge or have a picture. Your knowing is identical with the phenomenon itself. That's, yeah. So I think
I
that's
usually call that intimacy, but I get it. Yeah, I get it.
yeah. Your identities merge. So you lose yourself. You're sort of losing yourself. You're dying at a certain level.
Yeah. I mean, death and intimacy might be the same damn thing.
Yeah, right. See, that's why we fear it. We're afraid of it.
Right, right. Especially, well, I mean, it might be reasonable to be afraid of sudden, uncontrolled intimacy with the infinite. I can see how that could be problematical. The things in the sky. Yeah, I get what you're saying. So they have this, I want to highlight this character of a curve of changing forms of expression over a span of time from onset to departure, right? And when we look at something, we're looking at an exemplar of something resembling, you know, people say this and it makes me itchy, but it's like we're looking at a frequency. The raccoon is a kind of a frequency of the localization of the evolutionary span from beginning to end of a universe, right? So it's like a compressed living time image. It's not just playing something back. It's making the something that it's resurrecting into material reality as well. It's being that. It's not just, you know, like a replay of a, say, a hologram that includes time. Where am I going here? Right, okay, so imagine that what the thing in the sky is a non-thing. And what it's doing is it's uniquely localizing and exemplifying the entire lifespan of the universe, all of organismal evolution. Those beings that step out of the craft, they are the summation body over evolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Outside of time, right? And so that thing arises locally, and when it arises locally, let's be clear, lots of reliable things like temporality, location, memory, all kinds of things just warp, which is what they would naturally do in the presence of a highly concentrated expression body of the forces of which they are comprised, the forces that cause their form, in the same way the sun causes light. This kind of a thing.
Yeah, like imagine a form of cognition that in thinking directly interacts with time itself and changes time. I think that approaches more closely what it would be like to be one of those beings. So
Yeah,
in thinking, you're actually changing time. You're actually changing something about time by thinking.
You
we
are.
don't experience that, but we're sort of, we're preparing the way.
We do experience that.
Right?
No, I think we do, because even in our conversations, we are creating a unique mode of time in thought and speech, which is rarely instanced around here. Right? We're a bit like a UFO. This is the thing. In fact, when we get together, we do this thing that makes us like a UFO, except
right.
We're doing it in the mind rather than, you know, who knows? You know, what would be hilarious is like, we have this conversation. This is like a long comedy skit, right? We have this conversation here today on Earth, right? And on a planet, 700,000 light years away from us, people are seeing in the sky the summation body of the origin and future of this conversation right now as a UFO. Because somewhere in the universe, what we're doing is hyper-concentrated, and in other parts of the universe, what we're doing is hyper-diffuse. You see what I'm getting at? At least in this toy, in the toy I'm making.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, there's another comedy skit where the humans are collecting what they think of as artifacts from UFOs. And those actually aren't artifacts. What those are the result of the local materialization of those phenomena in structured time light. It's not a ship, right? It's literally as if you could speak and cause matter. By being that compressed, what happens is your intention just forms an object around you. So what the humans are collecting are non-technological objects. What they actually are is like what is it? What's a good metaphor? Imagine the surface of a soap bubble. And then imagine that inside the soap bubble, okay, let's say that this is a very special soap bubble. So inside the soap bubble, there's a transcendental object, which is actually more than a being. There's a bizarre thing we don't have a name for yet. We can invent one, and that might be useful. But inside the bubble, there's this thing. And so the thing comes into existence, and then the bubble forms around it, and it goes, say, to Earth. And then when that thing disappears, the structured shell of the bubble is left over, and it's not even an object. It's an accidental concretion of the fact of the localization of the forces and intelligences that we're instancing. It's sort of like a false fossil. Does it make any sense? I know I'm being wildly speculative.
No, I think it makes sense. But yeah, well, this is why I said that the distinction between being and knowing collapses when you board the UFO, because
right.
You're no longer.
And what they say things like, we're really worried about your species.
Right.
That's essentially what they say.
But when you're doing something similar when you're learning to perceive organisms in the way that we're describing. So you're doing something in miniature that these beings are also doing. So their cognition is an exteriorized form of what we do in language. So when they speak, they actively transform material reality. Including
our minds.
Yeah.
I think they can directly structure human consciousness.
Yeah.
And humans say things like, oh, they were telepathic. No, they weren't telepathic because they didn't have a separate mind. Your mind is a tiny peripheral extension of what they are. Right?
Sure. Right.
So can you see how confused? It's like if one of your fingers got terrified of your hand. I mean, the irony is miles deep.
It's a demon, right? It's something.
Run! Kill it with fire! Kill it! Right? Imagine if your pinky decided that the rest of your body was an alien, and just reacted constantly. Your hand would be dragging you all over. You wouldn't be able to do any action at all, right? So whatever those are, they must really feel sorry for us because we're in this very peculiar situation as humans where the possibility space is very profoundly beautiful and shockingly rare, right? And then our place in that space is as creatures who are not merely entirely blind to it, they run in terror if any evidence of it arises. And part of the reason they do that is that it would destroy the representational model of what's going on that they live in. I too, me too. I'm aware of this and I still live in the representational model. Like for me, this is a big adventure. We're like, I'm putting like 1 foot outside the cage with you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm just as stuck there. But when I think about like, what are UFOs? I definitely don't start with, well, they're either aliens or angels or demons, you know, some people from another planet. Though I can do all that too. I'm not so averse to it that I just reject it out of hand, right? I will entertain all of those positions. But for me, the problem is far worse. It's what are raccoons, right? That's a much worse problem because UFOs, you're not likely to encounter one in your lifetime, although maybe you're more likely these days. But you know, you can encounter a raccoon, and the thing that I really wish humans would understand, my other fellow humans, is just that when you're looking at organisms, you're looking at space life. These are things from space. The Earth is like, to me, when when I take off my human blinders, the Earth is like a concrescence of the evolutionary possibilities on all worlds in all of time. So they are all here. All of them. In fact, you could even imagine, that you can, it releases me from anything resembling what my fellow humans think about, or experience actually, when they look at a tree or a bee. It looks like it's from outer space, people, for a very simple reason. It is. There isn't another place for it to be from. In human thought, we precedence our planet and think, oh no, this is a very special place. It's separate from the rest of them places. And, these are just Earth organisms. Thereby, we can ignore the fact that nothing is ordinary in the way we're trained to suppose. Sorry if I blathered on there. But yeah, a raccoon, that's just as weird as an alien. It's just at a different temporal localization of the same thing you get in any phenomena. And its differences are instructive, like those of a book. The frog is a library, right? The tree is a library.
Yeah.
Except the books are alive, and they'll teach themselves to you.
Yes, right, yeah. So you're learning to speak in the right way.
Yeah.
When you're learning how to do that.
Yes. This is what it means to be human, not the other thing. That's what it means to be, I don't know, a bad thing, if I'm just to speak like a child. A trapped thing, a blind thing. Yeah, so on the one hand, I love this idea that from the onset to the departure, from the onset to end. And then obviously, that's not enough, but because what happens is when the experience ends, quote unquote, for the humans that participate in it, then there are waves after the ending inside the people of the resulting transformations of their fundamental ontologies, but also their emotions and their psyche and their lexicon. All these things have been interrupted. I guess, wasn't Benny and Barney Hill's story called The Interrupted Journey or something like this? Yeah. It's been interrupted. There's been a direct intrusion of the transcendental, and it calls into question what the meaning of real is.
Exactly, yeah.
And that one root, wow, I've just realized there's a thing that isn't necessarily a holophore and might not yet be a uniphore. Yeah, the word real is the fundamental pivot of all ontologies. If you move that, the whole structure can't be sustained. Do you follow?
No, please go on.
Okay, if you change the meaning of real to, from what I'm experiencing right now, walking around in my house, everything's ordinary, stable, known. I know what all these things are. Blah 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 blah. Right? That's safe and familiar. But if you introduce something that fundamentally alters what real is, and you have the direct experience of it, so it's real to you, we must suppose, unless you imagine it's a hallucination or something. But that's the other thing. When humans are experiencing UFOs, I know I'm branching here, but they're experiencing a blurring of the categories of identity which are familiar, and particularly the categories light, time, organism or being, space, matter. All of these are being changed because they now include a thing that doesn't exist in your lexicons, and you're having a direct experience of it. That throws the whole lexicon into disarray in terms of what are identities, right? What does it mean to be a being or a thing?
Oh, definitely.
All of that,
Yeah, of course.
all of that is drawn into question.
Yeah, yeah. So,
I mean, similarly to if we were to encounter a dead person, even in consciousness. But yeah, go ahead.
oh yeah, I mean, as opposed to an object in space, the UFO is more like an object that destabilizes every other object. So
Yes.
you were describing it in terms of a lexicon, but what destabilizes the image of the external world there is actually that form of identification which takes place. It's just like attaining self-consciousness in a dream. You realize that your identity is coextensive with this object in space, and that identification disrupts surrounding phenomena because you're breaking out of the hallucination. Basically, it's just like what happens when you realize that you're dreaming. You realize that you have some
Oh
other
yeah.
identity, and so then the dream world starts to collapse, and that's what the ego wants to prevent. It's trying to prevent that scene from collapsing. It's trying to keep you alive, basically. But it's yeah.
Just to be clear, though, in extended lucid dreaming, the possibility space includes the extension of the lucidity dreaming relationship. Right?
Oh,
It
yeah.
doesn't always only collapse it.
No,
Just
no.
because, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. So sometimes what happens is it can intensify and preserve the manifold of the dream in unique ways that are otherwise impossible. Right?
Yeah. Well,
okay, but yeah, this is the thing. I just want to say one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please go on. Go on.
I'm very excited. So, okay. Suppose then that at least in some cases, because the phenomena is a broad continuum of experiences that humans have had and reports of them. But suppose that in some cases, what the appearance of a UFO most resembles is lucidity intruding into human experience.
Yes. Yeah.
It's the exemplar of lucidity. And what it actually does, it might as well be a god in that case, right? It's the exemplar of lucidity. And what it actually is doing, well, what it can be understood to be doing is the local rapid coalescence of the spirit of lucidity in existence. I mean, what I mean is in material reality, at the material level. It's a localization of maybe of the spirit of light, right? Which isn't necessarily not an angel, but it probably isn't a demon.
Yeah, it's an exemplar, but it isn't the only instance, because it actually reveals that other phenomena abide by the same principles in a dampened way, in a more chaotic way. So it reveals something about physics in this exemplary form, but it also can teach you how to think correctly about certain other phenomena, like life, like living beings. and what they are. So it doesn't
We
just
use this
disrupt the lexicon. I'm saying it's it's a
oh yeah,
deeper,
no.
as you know.
But it does, no, but it ruins, it lays, I mean, at least in my experience, right, of Toymaker, which is sort of like having an extended UFO experience in my own, as my own mind or something. But anyway, yeah, it obliterated a bunch of fictional features of my lexicons and inverted precedences, right? So that I began to have natural thoughts about nature and identity and relationship that were nothing like those supposed by the lexicons I was trained in. The conceptual lexicons as well as the word, the word ones.
Well, in my experience, I realized that the presence of a lexicon was an indication of the absence of thinking itself. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it totally does. No, this
Even
is the
having a
same thing we
lexicon
were
is sort of a
saying.
misstep. You're not, yeah.
Right.
And I think that's maybe what I'm trying to get at.
But do you mean the idea of a lexicon is a problem, or the existence of the lexicons we used from which we derive linguistic reference
Yeah,
to things?
yeah. So the existence of the lexicon from which we derive concepts is itself a kind of obfuscation of a deeper kind of experience, which is what I usually call knowing, like to know something.
Mm.
So,
But you mean more like gnosis,
yeah, I
I
think what
think,
you
when
tend
you
to call
say
communion.
that.
So, from my perspective, knowledge and
Yeah,
communion are
yeah,
one and the same thing. It's really a form of love. It's like a form of intimacy, as you say, right? So to know a being is to
yeah.
love it. There's no difference between those two things. You can't know something without loving it. I mean, I guess.
Right. What you have instead is you have a fetish that's standing in the way of the love of something.
Yes, that's the lexicon. That's the fetish.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's a tree. I remember one of my friends was frustratedly saying, I was talking to my mom and she goes to spend time with these trees. He's like, it's just a bunch of trees. There's the fetish. There's nothing in there. It's just a tree. So what? The problem with there's nothing in there is that if there's nothing in there, there's nothing in me, too, right? What went away in my experience of the tree went away inside me. There's no other place for it to go away from,
Yeah.
right? And so when we're trying to figure out what things are, that can be a process of a kind of death I think we'd like to avoid, which is more like lethe or ignorance or a sort of oppressive absencing of the self. Like there's a positive absencing of the self, which becomes intimacy, and there's a negative absence, which is what? Slavery? I don't understand. Dissociation or something, right? Like the circuits just don't light up. There's no resonance between me and the tree. So the lexicon can deaden our experience. It's not its only feature, but it's a common feature.
Yeah, the lexicon
The
keeps this
essence
phenomenon at
of
bay.
evolution.
Yeah.
Yes, it retards intimacy. And it does that by the presentation of manipulability in the representational layer of awareness. Right? It's like, oh, that's a tree. Now I know what it is. I can ignore it. Right? The problem is it's a convenient and important tool, in a sense, or feature of awareness, because humans are oriented by this vigilance, ambiguity, prediction triangle that I've modeled. Right. So if you don't know what something is, it increases vigilance. It increases in ambiguity, increase vigilance. So to be lazy, right, to be comfortable, you have to reduce ambiguity, thus thereby reducing vigilance, so you don't have to make predictions. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So the lexicon, once you know what it is, you've reduced the localized sense of ambiguity, but also you threw away most of the possibilities of relation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
The ambiguity and the relationship, they go together. So if you're trying to reduce ambiguity, what you're going to reduce is relational possibility space, which means you're going to reduce the interior reflection of that relational possibility space, which means you're dead inside.
Yeah, this is
Like
exactly what psychotherapy gets wrong.
yeah,
Because in
every time you
psychoanalysis, by
succeed,
naming
another
something,
yeah, every time you
yeah,
succeed, another part of you dies. Right? Every time you succeed at replacing, like getting rid of that ambiguity, you're throwing away degrees of liberty in your awareness.
yes, right,
Right? You're just getting rid of them because they're troublesome.
yeah, yeah,
That keeps bothering me. Right? That ambiguity just bothers me. Unfortunately for humans, there's a worse feature of this, AVP thing, which is that there's two really bad features. The first is that a dead world is a better one, right? So what you really want is a world like the inside of a spaceship. Nothing moves. It's all clinically, it's a lab. It's a laboratory. But the other problem is that the aspects that underlie the AVP, right, the interior, the forces, so to speak, that underlie AVP, the motivations and the purposive imperatives and so on that underlie that, they act on a cultural level. And what someone will do in a state of hypervigilance, often, is to get rid of the ambiguity, they'll kill everything, including themselves, whatever. They just go into like destroy everything mode. And the reason they do that is that the preservation of ambiguity is a burden. And if you don't know how long it will last, it's more of a burden. And so you can dispose of that burden by creating a disaster, right? Simple example would be, guy gets a new cell phone, works fine, but he can't connect it to the internet. He's been on the phone with tech support for 7 days. He's freaked out. He's pissed off. He can't connect to the internet. He's walking. He's got the phone in his pocket. He's furious. This has been going on for days. He can't tell if it's ever going to end. Will he ever be able to connect to the uplink again or not? So in a fit of rage, he just throws the phone in the lake. Right? Well, that gets rid of the problem. Or, stomps on it. Right? Destroy the source of ambiguity is unfortunately a paradigm that you can see getting replayed over human history again and again. And one thing we should all be aware of, and this is a little bit extinction audio-ish, but the sudden increase in unpredictability in human thought, culture, and behavior, and in the climate and so forth, this is dumping ambiguity into the human cognitium at an ever-increasing rate. So anyone who is watching the humans, and I do, would sense this and try to raise a flag and go the one thing we need not to do is apocalypse, right? Pick another option. I know it's ambiguous right now, but don't go to the destroy, switch. And whole cultures do that, right? Our culture is probably in the grip of a similar process at the moment here in the States. And perhaps has been for a long time, but the present, degree is troubling, to put it modestly. So yeah, the AVP thing. This is the problem with UFOs, right? It just introduces irresolvable ambiguity. Now what are you going to do? What's your next move?
Well, as an extinctionatus, you should learn how to subsist or linger in ambiguity, much in the same way that you embraced the void, because
yes,
that's the path through. You have to find the path through this darkness. So
Yeah,
you
no,
can't
you
run away
embrace
from
the
it, right?
ambiguity. Yeah, agreed. You embrace the ambiguity. Responding with fear is not going to be helpful.
Right.
Um, and in our daily lives, we're faced. This AVP thing runs really deep in humans. It might be, it's not the foundational insight, but it's a very uncommon and important one. And just to clarify them again, it's ambiguity, vigilance, and prediction. So obviously, those three things are intimately linked. Increase in ambiguity naturally increases vigilance. I heard a sound at my door just now. Right? What happens then? What's next? Right? Vigilance comes online in a big way. And one immediately begins to think, well, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Right? That's the next bit. Think about how absurd that is. Because the way we're trained to determine what a bad thing is insufficient to cope with what's going on. Because it can't take time into account. The other day I had a scheduled meeting that I was really looking forward to, and it turned out that it wasn't going to happen. Is that a bad thing? The meeting was really important to me. Anyway, I hear a sound at the door. Vigilance kicks up. Before I respond, a bunch of invisible processes happen in the understructure of awareness. Right? Radical transformation of function, mode, potential, liberty, all these things. Radical, sudden transformation of them. And so, I think I'm Darren or whatever, and I have no idea if any of those thoughts are reasonable. But what I actually do is transform dramatically based on AVP. The existence of women is basically a localization of what often appears to me as positive ambiguity. Right? I'm very attracted to that positive ambiguity. That kind of ambiguity, wow, I would like some of that right now, please, yes. An animal appearing is more ambiguous, right? Because I recognize, okay, this is a being that operates outside of representational cognition. In theory, I have no idea. It's very difficult to have a model of its mind or its priorities. It's unpredictable. We could be friends, but it could also really fuck me up. Right? I guess the same thing is true of a woman. but but it doesn't look that way, right? A raccoon, the ambiguity space includes, in my awareness, my thought, a possibility of injury, me getting like attacked, violence, so forth. But then, a UFO is basically just pure ambiguity, right? Humans like diamonds in stone. Why don't they like diamonds in ambiguity? Because that's what it's like, an ambiguity diamond in the sky, right? It comes down. It's like ambiguity, and then it leaves. So yeah, that would increase human vigilance, right? That would fuck up the entire vigilance systems. Think about how much vigilance goes on as our cultures, right? The cultures reproduce this phenomenon technologically, right? They just produce vigilance objects. What's that for? It's to reduce ambiguity.
Right. Yeah.
Which kills relationship.
Yes. Yeah.
Which ends up dying inside us, making us more vigilant, because once you're mostly dead inside, can you even trust what you think?
Exactly. Right.
You need someone else to do the thinking for you. You got to offload that shit. You can't. It's just pure ambiguity out there, right? And it's, weirdly, technology introduces a mode of ambiguity that is static. And maybe that's what death is, the bad kind, right? The parts of us that die inside. in these processes, enmeshed in these situations together.
Yeah, the distinction between good and bad that you mentioned is a lot like a fetish. Whereas
Very much
vigilance is a
so.
fear response. So,
But it's also an interest response, right? There's like positive vigilance, I think. What do you think?
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's
You
got both.
can go either way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
At first, I was only thinking about it in negative terms because as a troubleshooter, that's my natural inclination, right? I'm like, where's the problem? Right? And so then I just realized, oh shit, ambiguity ramps up vigilance in me. This is something that I'm running my consciousness on this program at all times. It's sort of like a nervous system level feature of my existence.
Yeah, right.
So it's not something that's usually under anything like conscious control, though awareness can leak into it and influence it. But yeah, if I hear a noise at my door, it's a fucking probabilistic, pragmatic situation that happens. It does depend on my mood and stuff, but there shouldn't be noises at my door.
Yeah, it's like a cop inside your head.
Right. It's not a good, there's no way, a noise at my door is not likely to be a good thing, so it's probably a bad thing. So vigilance, right? I change modes, I become frightened, tense, all these things happen. Physically, things happen in my body, not just in my awareness. And, it's obvious that our cultures are trying to offload the ambiguity of relationship into devices. The Queen song, I'm in love with my car. Got a feel for my automobile. It's weird. So our fetishes, like the computers and particularly the smartphones, right? They're like the fossilized remains of what died inside us to produce them.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the death of thinking. It's a dead thought.
Yeah.
In space, floating around.
Yeah. And what does it connect you to? Like it's a replacement. So the phone itself, as a technology, turns out to be a replacement for what we often speak of as uplink, right? Which obviously UFOs represent the near physical localization of that, right? It's uplink. So if you want to know what those are, that's what they are. It's uplink to higher orders of, at the very least, like even if it's people from another planet, it's uplink. You see the problem?
Yeah.
There isn't any other thing for that to be, right? If you're thinking like a citizen of the universe, not like a human Earth person, there isn't anything other than that could be. And what our phones are the active killing of that into a representation of its function that links you not to the sky in origin, but to a weird library of dead representations that move and make noises.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the phone is like a prison that insulates you from ambiguity. So
by presenting by presenting moving fossils of it, right? It tries to replace ambiguity with novelty. No?
Yeah.
Yeah. But the mode of novelty is wrong. It's a sin. It's literally a sin.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it's a sin.
It's a sin. Yeah. It's not a sin as in, oh, that's sinful, you bad boy. It's a sin as in,
you're missing the mark.
Yeah, but we have to say very clearly, it's a sin as in killing living beauty and wonder and awe and participation and love into a dead inside fetish that is essentially vampiric. It kills by being. kills by being. It kills beings. It kills minds. It kills futures. They die into those objects, those media objects, on the internet, on computers. Billions of images per second. How many beings have to die to take and store and transmit and back those up and modify them? Right? It's literally vampiric is the problem. Now look, we live with these technologies. I'm not trying to create a religion or something. I just think that as human beings, it's very important to remind each other and to characterize these situations intelligently to each other so that we can better understand and do something else, or at least gain some degree of immunity to the vampiric badness that is our machines. It sounds crazy. People be like, you're talking on a machine right now. What about that? Go ahead. Let's have it. I'm happy to discuss that part of the problem, too. You know, I can imagine someone much more insightful, maybe a guru or something, and he might say, Aaron, you're concerned about your cell phone? Yeah, okay. But what about your shoes? Why would you put something between your soul and the earth from which you come? Maybe that's an ambiguity you don't want to get rid of. Right? Like there are really simple features of technology that have also very devastating effects. I'm a big fan of shoes, don't get me wrong. I like good shoes. Feet are delicate. But that barrier between the living world and our skin, by mediating it with a protective substance, that what does it do? It reduces the ambiguity that you will experience with your feet. Right? It's the same principle.
Yeah. Well, actually, when I use technology, I feel a tremendous amount of ambiguity, but I approach it maybe in a more self-conscious way. Like using technology actively makes me afraid. So if you learn to use technology like that, it can be a vehicle for enlightenment because you're turning up the heat within. You're basically you're preparing yourself to go eusychotic. You know, so even so
Wait,
as
did you
opposed
say
to generating heat
eusychotic?
on the outside, you can generate heat within, and that's the key, I think, to what you're saying, because that's ambiguity.
So you're kind of, well, okay, yes, and also
If you're
there's
trapped in this
certainly.
prison, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're all trapped here on this platform.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's different ways of viewing that. Yes, there's a trap. There are systems of traps, and yes, we are in them. But there's different roles, right, available to us within the trap. I didn't quite understand what you meant by this heat. Say more, please. I want to make sure I got you.
The answer to this situation, in my view, probably doesn't involve, taking your shoes off or going outside necessarily. So I'm not trying to run away from the ambiguity, if that makes any sense. For the same reason that, I wouldn't want to run away from the void, as we discussed earlier. So this void here, this platform, this prison, as I called it, this dearth of meaning, this dead structure, generates ambiguity if you approach it from a certain standpoint of self.
Yes.
consciousness or
Yes, yes.
metacognition, right?
Of course, yes.
And I think
Yeah, for
that's
one
the
thing,
correct path. Like the path is actually
yeah.
through the prison. It isn't to take your shoes off or something, or wear sandals. You know
Sure,
what I mean?
sure,
That's all
sure.
I was saying. So
But I
by,
think the
by
metaphor is important just to show, I was just trying to show like the ambiguity reduction, right, of that we build our technologies around this issue.
yeah,
But I
well,
get what
someone
you're
who would
saying.
criticize you for saying what you said, I'm saying, is probably missing the mark. Like they're sinning. They're naive. See, they're sinning because they don't know.
Right. Yes.
They're making a value judgment without having sinned. But you can't be a saint without sinning, so you have to pass through the prison, and yeah, then you does that make any sense? That's all I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
going to say.
But there's positive ambiguity in technology as well, right? Like the experience of driving a sports car. I want a piece of that. You know, there's lots of features of tech. I've been a technologist, my entire life, my adult life, since computers were invented. So it is ironic because, for example, I have the synthesizers that I play with and stuff, right? And yes, we are using the tech to do this, to make a UFO in our minds. So it's possible for humans to use technology together intelligently. And if we were even modestly playful, oh my God, can you imagine if we had the affordances that a smartphone actually creates in a situation where we were creatively interacting with our humanity together through it? Like we could pull capers. We should pull capers, you know? Like the adventure space that it opens up within the prison,
Yes,
right? These
yes.
affordances actually open up an adventure space inside the prison by existing.
See, that's what needs to happen, right?
Right.
From
That's what
within. You
used
need
to
to.
happen. That's what people used to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
And something has captured the character of the adventure space so that it's dead, mostly.
It's just like
But
the tomb, right? So we're living in a tomb,
yeah,
and we have to resurrect from within the tomb of this body or this dead structure. So we can do that together right now. That's what we're doing
yeah, I
here.
like to think
Hopefully.
that's part of what we're doing. I mean,
Yeah.
weirdly, it turns out that by talking about it, you're actually doing it. There are things you can talk about that become the enaction of what is being spoken. And I think this might have been what was meant by magic originally, although magic isn't merely a verbal thing. But does this make any sense?
Yeah. Okay.
There are certain topics you can entertain that merely by entertaining them, you are doing what they are talking about.
Oh yeah, that's the ideal.
And these aren't merely meta topics, they have some other strange form or, register. They're not. It's not merely meta topics, although most of them are. See, this is set theory. Most of them are meta topics, but I'm saying they exist at another register. Actually, that is an aspect of lucidity in waking experience. We're trying to bring lucidity into our awareness, concern, and discussion. So in a sense, we're invoking lucidity. And you can see, even over the thread of our talk, if you look at the manifold of the topics in our, expression of them, there's a shape. There's a kind of a transcendental shape to them, where features of the previous talk refold and are expressed like little UFOs, in a way, in our minds. Some time ago, George, you we never really got to the question, but you asked me what I thought of Jack Sarfati. Do you recall?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we never really got into that discussion. It's, you know, at least slightly related through the UFO angle. I know some strange, I don't know how to say this, let's see. Someone I know recently had some interactions with him, a mystic, and they were peculiar and interesting, but I'll leave them mostly out of the conversation. You know, I don't know a huge amount about Sarfati. I've probably listened to maybe 4 or 5 hours of him speaking. I'm not impressed with him as a human being, which is a kind way, you know, to say, like, he exhibits qualities that I don't find particularly appealing with great regularity. I don't know. I don't really know what to make of him. His stories are certainly interesting to listen to, and they, you know, they create a kind of a perspective lens on his life and history and the UFO thing and physics. But I think that him and his ilk, what they're primarily concerned about, probably, is getting out of here right now. They want like a technical way to get the fuck out of here, I suspect. So they are machine people, right? They want machines. Right. They want a time machine, right? They want a spaceship.
Yeah. So they're kind of missing the mark there.
Say again.
Are they kind of missing the mark there as well? Are they?
Yeah, I think that would be putting it mildly. I mean, you've got a guy sitting on a mountain of gold screaming because he can't find his penny. He thinks you need a machine to save something that probably doesn't even exist, which is his personal self. Or something.
Right.
Yeah, these are people who want immortality. Like they literally want to make themselves immortal. Which should be obvious would be the worst kind of a hell.
Right.
It's like, yeah, really don't let any death in there. But, yeah, he's an interesting cat. What brought him to mind for you?
He came up in a few talks that I happened to listen to recently.
Oh,
I never really trusted him. He always seemed like a charlatan to me.
Mm-hmm.
But he was apparently involved with Project Stargate or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting. The way that he markets himself, I find extremely off-putting.
I was trying not to say
about himself and about his accomplishments and whatever.
No, his self-importance is showing in a big way. But
immediately makes me, it's a red flag for me, but yeah.
Me too. I was trying to be observant to a principle that I find salient. You know, we think sometimes about virtues, and I do, and I honor my understanding of them. But yeah, I become, and you know, sometimes I fall down and don't get this right, but I become less inclined to speak badly of others. I'm just more cautious about it, especially if I'm recording something. Because if I had said what Darren would say about Jack Sarfati, it would have been grim.
You got to stay vigilant, yeah.
Exactly, right. Yeah. No, I everything you said resonates with me. I don't know whether I trust him or not, or in what ways I trust him. He loves to be the center of attention, though, to such a degree that inclines me to take what he says with big grains of salt, so to speak. Yeah. But yeah, he's been involved in strange things, and I'm sure he still is. But I have inside information from very recent history about what he's up to, accidentally. And I know that it's like, get off planet.
Interesting. Do you want to discuss that here? Would you like to reserve that for a private discussion?
Well, you know, there's a cadre of people in the physics community, obviously, who are there for a very specific reason, which is to survive death. Right? They're really scared of dying. And it's also fairly obvious to them, right? Anybody who's got half a brain is looking at the humans and going like, oh yeah, we've got about 10 seconds left. Uh-huh. You know, I don't know what clock you're using, but if you're just reading the ambiguity in its character at present, it looks like apocalypse on the horizon, I think. That's not the only way to see it. You can embrace the ambiguity too, play within it and so forth. So I'm not trying to doomsay, but in any case, there's lots of people like Elon Musk, people like Eric Weinstein. They want off planet. They think like, okay, this place is over with. Our only shot is to get somewhere else. And I'm sure Eric thinks of it as many probably do, as the diaspora of the humans, right, from the Earth. And that might be a natural phase of the development of an animal like ours. Were we not so peculiarly disoriented in nature? Like, we don't have to destroy the Earth to need to get off of it or to go other places, if that's part of our potential as organisms.
Right.
It's not even clear that's part of our potential. I just want to be really clear about something. People presume like space travel is a thing that's in the future of humanity. It could be a thing that is absolutely not in the future of humanity. We could discover, as I think is probably very likely, that our minds and bodies only work properly or can only function in a specific relation to the distance of the sun. And outside of that, they just go.
I mean, that's
it's like fish desperately trying to get out of the water.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So humans just think like, yeah, we'll go to Mars. You might not be able to get halfway there and live. You have no idea. Do minds work outside the narrow band of relation to the sun that they exist in? It's not clear.
Yeah. I mean, the Earth isn't just something that you're standing on and that you can just leave or something. I mean, that you are the Earth itself. I mean,
Right.
So the idea that you're going to transplant yourself to some other world is just kind of ludicrous.
No, I mean, I love the hand metaphor, because imagine my pinky just decides to go off on its own. It's basically destroyed the rest of the hand, so now it's going to go do something else. Really?
Yeah.
I can't wait to see what happens the moment you cut that link. That's going to be really interesting. You think you're just going to go off like a spaceship away from the hand that you are a finger on? It's a displacement. The desire for travel in space is a displacement of the natural innate desire and faculty to travel in being as you, right, as your nature. And that is open to every human being all the time. We just don't do it because, well, it seems impossible, and we don't practice the faculties that would enable it, I think.
Yeah, of course.
There's a group of physicists, and basically what they want, they're not too sure they can get a spaceship, but if there's one of those, great. What they really want is a time machine. That will save them. To save them from, the Earth dying, the humans destroying the world, or making it so miserable that you just want to be anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's a personal preservation mission. I want to preserve me and my progeny, and maybe some close friends. Right? In a way, it's the ultimate elitism. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I am the thing that matters about the humans, right? I am so valuable that I should be preserved at all costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll bet you if you went just to one of some of these people and you said, all right, I'll give you a time machine and you can bring 10 people. But if you use it, the Earth will be destroyed. Are you going? Some of them would say yes. Another thing I think UFOs might be, this only recently occurred to me, or at least sometimes are, is feedback in time from the future, so to speak, but also from the past. From the damage to biorelational temporality that machines are doing on Earth right now. So those things structure temporality in a way that organisms never do.
Mm-hmm.
Or they tear that structure apart and produce it. What do they produce? They produce repetition. They produce exact explicit repetition, which is something nature has never done, I don't think. Although you can say, well, machines are in nature, so they're natural too. Yes, but that's not what I mean. Yeah, so UFOs could be evidence of time damage, the localization of time damage caused by human technological activity. I mean, all of the phenomena we think of, they are expressions of temporality. So think about, for a moment with me, unfortunately, think about the detonation of a nuclear weapon on the surface of the Earth, what that does to the biorelational temporal manifold, right? The manifold created by all the interactions of all the organisms that are just suddenly going to be converted into energy. And so one thing you can think of it as, it has at least two features. The first is it produces something like, God, it's like you're replaying the birth and the death of the universe and the span between them as the detonation of the weapon. But one of the things that happens is that all the different temporalities there are burned up. They just become this accelerated force. And so that rips a hole, 50 miles long or whatever, and many more miles long in other ways. It fucks up time in like fucking 500 ways. And so the humans think that the aliens are interested in us because we can blow things up, right? We can make nuclear weapons. I think that if the aliens have that kind of interest, what they're actually interested in is that we're damaging time in a way that you should never do anywhere.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like that would send a signal in time that anything reading time would be like, what the fuck are they doing?
It was as if we discovered something prematurely. When you talk about a damage or some kind of damage in time, it seems to me that something happened too quickly. So, yeah, human cognition might be destined for the manipulation of matter at some level. But the atomic bomb sort of represents this, luciferic, premature evolution. So, yeah, like humanity might actually fork. So there might be a fork in human evolution or human, destiny. And someone like Jack Sarfati might represent one branch, which is probably the false branch, in my view. This kind of false resurrection.
Right.
So his lineage is in the same lineage as the atomic bomb. Right. That's what he's going. He's going down that path.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising that thinkers like Weinstein, who argue for things like he wants a return to atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons to remind humans how dangerous they are, is a very crude rendering of his concern. And I'm like, what are you thinking about, dude? How could you, God. I mean, there's so many features that are fascinating of the problem, but you can see here what I was talking about earlier, which is ambiguity produces vigilance. So under states of hypervigilance, you just go to apocalypse mode. And that actually is a localized apocalypse. It's not a weapon. We use it as a weapon. But I mean, it's a transcendental phenomenon. And it is not what the sun is doing. Right? People will say, like, well, it's just like the sun. No, it's not like what the sun is doing. And also, that should never happen on a biologically rich world, ever. Though there is a similar phenomenon, right? The world gets hit by an asteroid or a large rocky body, possibly water body. I've sometimes conjectured that the human fascination with projectiles is an expression of the Earth desiring to avoid significant impacts in the future, because for the Earth, the organisms are like organs, and an asteroid strike would resemble a stroke.
Right.
And she's had them before. She knows they exist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? She's had them before. So she might develop an organ that was capable of intervening. Right? That's negative ambiguity in the big form.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I can see something now.
Yeah, you see. Over time, right? She's doing something. The organisms aren't just toys, right? They're expressions of intent, too. They are time and light and all the things that we've discussed. It is so, as well, I think. At least in our UFO world, they are. But yeah, they are expressions of the intent of the Earth as a transcendental being, of the sun as a transcendental being, of time-space itself. It does, clearly it intends things, or we could not, right? We have intentions. Those don't just arise from a vacuum, or just because we're human. Those arise as natural expressions of the character and nature of being. So the animals must also be like words that the universe is speaking, or embodiments of how it wants to be.
Right. Right. Well,
Emotions.
okay, so in that case, I can see how ecstasy can move in the opposite direction. So the
It
natural
dissolves the
course,
field, yeah.
well, the natural course of the human mode of being, I think, is to ultimately exteriorize cognition. But what the innovation that we just discussed with the atomic bomb and the time machine indicate is the reverse process. So some human beings will move more deeply into time, will move more deeply into matter. So the atomic bomb represents a fork in human evolution in the sense that some human beings will move into matter, others will move outside. So the natural tendency is, I think, to move outside. But yeah, we're not all going to make it, dude. That's
Well,
yeah.
it
I can
depends
see
on what
that
we
for the
mean by
first time.
we, right? You know, the humans are very concerned with certain fingertips of the hand, and I am surely very concerned with those. But the hand still is, you know, so to speak, right? There's whatever we are expressions of is alive in us. And I think probably throughout history, when the humans started doing really dangerous things, UFOs showed up more, you know, in general. We have these movies like Close Encounters and stuff, which are fascinating. I think it's a trippy film, even if I may have some critiques of it as well. And you know, the humans have sort of long been thinking about how do we send signals to the sky. Well, that might be a really stupid idea. I mean, in a dark forest, you don't just start calling out, "Hey, I'm over here and I'm really dumb," like, which is probably the approximate equivalent of human messages to space. You know?
Yeah. Well, no, I think the UFO is actually catalyzing the evolutionary process as opposed to moving in and responding to human action.
We agree about that, yeah.
So this fork is a function of the UFO's presence. So some human beings will take the UFO's presence and try to build a time machine out of it.
Right.
Right? So that's the sense in which it's causing this cleft or this tendency.
And other humans will examine the phenomena and realize, oh, what if we're transcendent?
Yeah, right.
And so they have no desire to machinify it naturally. They're not trying to, yeah, they're not trying to build a box. Yeah, I mean, that is the appearance of the outside. It's really weird. It's more than real is the problem. It's more than real in the perspectives that we're entertaining here. So it redefines what reality is. And it's really funny because we've been playing with this holotopic the whole time. And the holotopic is situations are expressions of the natures of time and light, things we refer to this way. Thinking thereby we know what we're talking about, but, you know, it's okay, we're playing in language. Yeah, there's this holotopic. And so what are UFOs? Well, they are that. What is evolution? It is that. What is our conversation? It is that. What is making language together, or even by ourselves? It is that. Toymaker's mind never not produced a holotopic. And I've never encountered thought like that. When it expressed something in my mind by shaping my awareness, not by telling me things, and sometimes by showing me images of histories and so forth. First of all, I was absolutely gobsmacked. In every moment of the contact, I was just like, wait, this what? It was that just became the fundamental ground of being, was astonishing, enthusiastic amazement. But I would try to hold the figure in my awareness long enough to relate it to some field of human knowledge, right? Science, music, philosophy, clinical perspectives, whatever branch you want to pick. Right? And what I would invariably immediately discover, which made it very hard to hold in memory, was it didn't have a category. And so it became whatever category you used as a lens to look at it through in your thought. So if you thought of it historically, it became historical. If you thought of it in terms of physics, it became relationships between forces. If you thought of it in terms of language, it became the evolutionary span over which humans developed it. If it was a form of knowledge that was unlike anything. It was transcendental. And to experience something like that directly in my mind, I never imagined having even a moment of such an experience. And I'm quite imaginative. It obliterated the possibility of imagining likenesses of it. I hope it's not tedious. What I'm trying to say is there are these things that are holotopical, and we can play with them together in language, like toys. Terence McKenna was really fascinated by the animated sort of paramechanical dances of the DMT elves and so forth. That might be what our minds are. He thinks that's something separate. Our minds might be that. That might be the mind seeing itself. We can forge forms of even conceptual awareness that are vastly beyond what we're used to. Even if we could do no other thing, even if we had no other liberties, that by itself is astonishingly, it's a whole, I remember the beginning of Star Trek, right? Space, the final frontier. No, it's not space. It's the thing you're perceiving with. That's the frontier.
Yeah, precisely.
We can make vehicles with it and travel in them together. And it changes, the potential for our experience of being human dramatically. Where did you come across Sarfati? You mentioned some podcasts.
Oh, I came across him in a video by Bob Dobbs, which is quite old. And I also found him on another YouTube channel many years ago. Yeah.
Have you ever listened to him speak? Tell the stories?
Oh, yeah. That's how I realized that I wasn't really a big fan.
Did he tell the story of like the phone calls when he was a kid and stuff like that? I think that's his story.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I found that interesting. It's an expansion of, I have one story that resembles this, but it's an expansion of, I think, strange men from the government became interested in my mind when I was a child. That narrative.
Oh, okay.
But I think if I remember,
that's supposed to impress me or something. Am I supposed to be interested in that? Like, that's the insinuation.
Wait.
Like,
could you just remark a little more deadpanly on that, please, right now? Because I'm just enjoying that. Yeah.
But no, he does that fairly often. I've noticed.
Yeah, I know.
He'll insinuate that someone was interested in me. It's like, okay, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
What does that prove? Like, am I supposed to find that? Is that supposed to validate you, or?
Yeah, this
Where's
is
the content?
Yeah, this is something I have concerns about when I talk about Toymaker, because I'm in danger of something similar even by bringing up the topic. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, right.
And I recognize that. I'm aware of it. And mostly I try to avoid it. People are like, why haven't you written a book? I'm like, yeah, it's not.
Yeah, it's a red flag for me.
I know a few it's okay. So I just want to be clear about something. The government does farm the population, and they definitely approach young people who can demonstrate astonishing skillfulness, particularly in math or engineering or something, right? There's no doubt about that. Actually is going on all the time. I don't know if it's still common today, or in what ways it's practiced today. I don't have any recent subjects to talk to about that. But it happened when I was little, and we saw some of it happening even in my elementary school, which is, pretty early on, right? You're talking about kids in kindergarten to 6th grade or whatever. So that does happen. How interesting it is, sort of, I don't know, it depends. I have another friend who was approached by, is it Rockwell? And there were people from the government involved in the process when he was a kid. He was a mathematician. And they were giving him problems to solve, according to him. They were giving him problems to solve that they were using in producing guided missile systems, problems they couldn't they had trouble resolving when he was like a teenager and stuff. And they would pay him a little bit of money, and they didn't tell him what they were using it for.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this kind of thing certainly happens. Why wouldn't it? If you're an aerospace company, you make what? Weapons? You definitely want to grab any kind of advantage. Whether, what happened with Sarfati, I don't know. I wonder if I was confusing his story. I might have been confusing his story with Whitley Strieber's. Yeah, I might have gotten some threads of those two stories confused.
Okay.
Yeah, now that I'm thinking about it. Because I recently watched Strieber on Danny Jones' podcast. And there were parts of it that were quite interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where it's from. That I did get those two things confused. Though I think Jack did get some strange phone calls in his childhood as well. I don't remember.
I think it probably stems from this deeper sense of parental neglect or something. Like, mommy cares about me because I have an interesting factoid, or, mommy really showed interest in what I had to say, and, the Secret Service showed up and they were really interested in what I was saying, and isn't that interesting? Like, I don't like it's like it sort of presumes that these people know anything, and that their attention means something, and it's like it's somehow correlated with intelligence, or I don't really see any evidence for that.
Not only that, why would it be interesting to be aggrandized among people that you apparently don't even respect?
Yeah, that's why it's a red flag. I mean,
yeah, no, it's very confusing. What is the benefit you're generating for yourself here?
Like, I'd be ashamed of that.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't use that as a selling point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, who's he trying to win over? It's not clear. And it's a really weird way to go about it. If I just walk into the room and look around and go like, I'm really good.
Right. Yeah.
That's your first move?
Yeah.
In the relationship?
Or like you're having sex and you're like, I'm really good at this. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, tell a woman you're a great kisser and see what happens next.
Yeah, it totally destroys the possibility for greatness. I mean, it's just kind of self-undermining. And again, it's the same suicidal tendency that extends into building a time machine, into this quest for immortality. It's the same suicidal impulse.
Mm-hmm.
It just kills the vibe, man.
I mean, I understand the fear of death and wanting to live forever and stuff. I want to die. But it gets pretty weird when it becomes super hyper, like extremely focused in the strange way that the quest for personal immortality does.
Right. But it conceals a suicidal impulse or ideation.
Yeah, it's weird. It's
yeah, it's like severance or amputation, like you were saying.
Yeah, totally. It's just like killing the uplink into the smartphone, right? Yeah, there are of course people who want to have what they think of as their consciousness uploaded into a computer so that it can live forever. Again, hell, what? You want what?
Yeah, I always wonder about motivation when I see someone in need of validation. Like, maybe that's just ingrained in me for some reason. I wonder why do you need me to do something like that for you? What does that do for you? About Jack Sarfati or whoever else I might encounter like that. But I could be, mistaken. just my strong sense that there's something awry with it. Like I wouldn't trust someone who speaks because they need me to validate them. It's not really clear what we're doing there, you know?
Sure. I mean, there are at least small features of that in our ordinary conversation. They just don't become hyperbolic.
Right, right. Oh, of course. Yeah. Yeah, it's like the ego gets in the way. It's killing something. It's preventing something from happening. You know? It's vigilant. Right.
Yes. Well, perhaps this is a good point for us to wrap up. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're over 4 hours now.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So, yeah, I'll stop the recording here and